Welcome, traveller of time and seeker of rest. Tonight, as the world outside slows its pace and the shadows lengthen, we step away from the chaotic rush of the modern era. We invite you to let go of the day's burdens, to settle into the quiet comfort of your surroundings, and to let your mind drift into the soft velvet corridors of the past. Throughout the grand and often turbulent tapestry of European history, power was not always negotiated on muddy battlefields, nor was it always decided by the thunder of cannons or the clash of steel. More often than not, the true destiny of empires, the redrawing of vast continental borders, and the subtle shifting of global power were decided in the quietest of spaces. They were sealed with the stroke of a quill on parchment, within the hushed chambers of diplomatic courts, and most profoundly at the altar of royal weddings. These were the marriages of state. To the common observer of the time, they appeared as grand spectacles of unimaginable wealth, parades of silk, the ringing of cathedral bells, and the dazzling display of crowns. But beneath the velvet cloaks and the glittering jewels lay a world of cold calculation, intricate family trees, and long-term geopolitical strategy. A single union could merge two rival kingdoms, put an end to generations of friction, quietly plant the seeds for a future empire that would dominate the world for centuries to come. These weddings were rarely about personal affection. They were the ultimate chess moves played by monarchs who viewed their own children as the most valuable pieces on the board. Tonight, we will gently explore these quiet turning points of history. We will look past the surface glamour of the ceremonies to examine the deep structural consequences of these unions. We will trace how diplomatic correspondence, carefully negotiated marriage treaties, and court records reveal the slow, deliberate reshaping of Europe. We will witness how individual lives intersected with broad political goals, creating alliances that were both fragile and formidable. As you listen to these stories, let the calm rhythm of the narrative wash over you. There is no urgency here, no sudden alarms, only the steady, peaceful flow of history guiding you toward a deep and restorative sleep. The channel Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional value. Let us drift back in time to the late 15th century, to a land bathed in the warm golden light of the Mediterranean sun, yet fractured by political division. This is the Iberian Peninsula, a region of dry plateaus, rugged mountains, and ancient cities divided into several distinct kingdoms. Among them, the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon stood as powerful neighbours, often viewing each other with a mixture of caution, rivalry, and unspoken necessity. In Castile, a young princess named Isabella found herself navigating a court filled with whispers, shifting loyalties, and immense danger. She was not originally destined for the throne, yet the unpredictable currents of royal lineage soon placed her in a position of critical importance. To her half-brother King Henry, she was a valuable diplomatic pawn, a currency to be traded for foreign alliances that would serve his immediate political survival. Plans were made to marry her to various suitors across Europe, princes from Portugal, France, or Aragon, each alliance carrying its own weight of consequence. But Isabella possessed a quiet determination, a mind that looked far beyond the immediate horizon. She understood that her marriage would decide not just her personal happiness, but the very survival of Castile. Across the border in Aragon, another young royal, Prince Ferdinand, watched the unfolding drama with equal intensity. Aragon was a seafaring power, its eyes turned toward the trade routes of the Mediterranean. Yet its rulers knew that their security was forever tied to the massive landmass of Castile. The negotiations between Isabella and Ferdinand's supporters were conducted in the deepest secrecy. Messages were carried by trusted couriers along darkened mountain paths, written in ciphers and hidden within the lining of travel cloaks. A marriage between Castile and Aragon would create a union of unprecedented strength, but it was a path fraught with peril. Powerful factions within Castile opposed the match, fearing the loss of their own influence under a unified crown. On a cool, starlit night in October 1469, Ferdinand travelled in disguise through the Castilian countryside, posing as a servant to avoid detection by hostile forces. He slipped into the city of Valladolid, where Isabella awaited him. Their first meeting was brief, held in a quiet room far from the prying eyes of the court. There were no grand banquets, no cheering crowds. They spoke in soft, measured tones, recognizing in each other a shared vision, a dream of a unified, stable realm. A few days later, on October 19th, they were married in a modest palace in Valladolid. Because they were cousins, a special papal dispensation was required for the union to be legal. Due to the haste and secrecy of the wedding, a document was hastily produced, one that would later be revealed as a clever forgery, though it served its purpose in the quiet moments of their vows. As they stood before the altar, exchanging rings under the soft glow of candlelight, they signed a marriage contract that carefully balanced their respective powers. Isabella remained the sovereign of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, ensuring that both kingdoms maintained their distinct laws, customs, and identities, even as their destinies became permanently intertwined. The immediate aftermath of their vows was not a period of peaceful triumph, but of quiet anticipation. The news of their union rippled through the courts of Europe, prompting frantic discussions in Lisbon, Paris, and Rome. Monarchs and diplomats realized that the balance of power in the West had quietly but permanently shifted. Together, Isabella and Ferdinand had laid the foundation for a unified Spain, but the road ahead was shrouded in the mists of uncertainty, and the quiet alliance they had forged was about to face its very first test. As the dust settled on the Iberian Peninsula, the art of dynastic weaving was being elevated to its absolute peak in the heart of Central Europe. Here within the grand snow-dusted halls of Vienna and Brussels, the House of Habsburg was beginning to craft a geopolitical strategy that would redefine the meaning of empire. While other nations poured their fortunes into the raising of vast armies and the construction of massive fortresses, the Habsburgs recognized a simpler, more enduring truth, that a well-placed signature on a marriage contract could conquer more territory than 1,000 swords. At the centre of this strategy was Emperor Maximilian I, a man of immense ambition and deep foresight. Maximilian understood that his territories, scattered and vulnerable to the pressures of surrounding rival powers, needed a web of alliances to ensure their survival. He looked across the European continent not with the eye of a conqueror, but with the eye of a master weaver, looking for threads that could be tied together to form an unbreakable fabric. His gaze eventually fell upon the newly unified kingdoms of Spain, where Isabella and Ferdinand had successfully consolidated their power. The Spanish monarchs had a daughter, the Infanta Joanna, a young woman of sharp intellect and deep sensitivity. Maximilian, in turn, had a son, Philip, known to history as Philip the Handsome, who ruled over the wealthy, bustling merchant cities of the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. In the quiet chambers of diplomacy, long before the bride and groom would ever look upon one another, the ambassadors of Austria and Spain spent months negotiating the terms of this union. Every clause was scrutinized, every potential inheritance was calculated with mathematical precision. The goals were clear. Spain sought an ally to help balance the growing power of France, while the Habsburgs desired access to the immense maritime wealth and expanding global influence of the Spanish crown. In the autumn of 1496, a grand fleet set sail from Spain, carrying Joanna across the unpredictable waters of the Bay of Biscay to the shores of Flanders. The journey was long and exhausting, a physical manifestation of the vast distance that this marriage was intended to bridge. When Joanna and Philip finally met in the historic city of Lille, the attraction between them was immediate and intense, a rare occurrence in the cold world of dynastic arrangements. their wedding celebrated with quiet elegance in the town of Leer, was a moment of profound significance that went largely unnoticed by the common people of the time. To the outside world, it was simply another alliance between two distant ruling families. But beneath the surface, this union created a massive bridge across the European continent. It linked the misty ports of the North Sea with the sun-drenched plains of Castile, creating a political axis that completely encircled their traditional rivals. This marriage was not merely a diplomatic handshake, it was a profound merging of heritages. The cultural traditions of the Burgundian court, famous for its refined etiquette, music, and art, began to blend with the deeply religious and stoic traditions of the Spanish kingdom. In the quiet palaces of Brussels, the young couple established a court that became a crossroads for European thinkers, humanists, and diplomats. Yet, as the early years of their marriage passed in a blur of courtly life and family growth, the true weight of this union began to reveal itself through the laws of succession. Unforeseen tragedies within the Spanish royal family, the sudden deaths of Joanna's older siblings, gradually shifted the line of inheritance. Suddenly, the quiet household in Flanders was no longer just a provincial court, it was the birthplace of the future masters of the world. The mists of time began to gather around the young family, as they realized that the children playing in their quiet gardens would one day inherit a collection of titles, lands and crowns unlike anything Europe had seen since the days of Charlemagne. The quiet marriage of 1496 had set in motion a chain of events that would soon bring the entire continent to the brink of a new era, leaving diplomats and rival kings to watch in silent apprehension as the true scope of the Habsburg network began to unfold. The grand design woven by Emperor Maximilian and the monarchs of Spain reached its full, staggering realization in the person of a single child, born in the quiet Flemish city of Ghent, Charles of Habsburg. By the laws of dynastic succession, this young prince inherited a collection of crowns that defied imagination. He became King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, and eventually Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. His lands stretched from the foggy borders of Saxony to the sun-baked plains of Andalusia, and far across the Atlantic Ocean to the newly charted territories of the Americas. It was an empire, as contemporaries noted with a sense of awe, upon which the sun never set. Yet holding such an immense patchwork of territories together was a task of unimaginable complexity. Charles spent his life in a state of perpetual movement, travelling from one corner of his domain to another, trying to quiet rebellions, manage finances, and maintain a fragile peace among peoples who shared neither language nor customs. The vast wealth of the New World was slow to arrive, and the costs of maintaining defensive alliances and governing far-flung provinces left the imperial treasury perpetually drained. To secure his position, particularly within his Spanish kingdoms, where he was initially viewed as an outsider, Charles knew he needed a union that would provide both financial stability and domestic peace. He turned his gaze toward the neighbouring kingdom of Portugal, a maritime nation that had quietly amassed incredible wealth through its pioneering trade routes to India and Brazil. The Portuguese Infanta, Isabella, was renowned not only for her grace, but for her exceptional administrative intelligence. The negotiations for this Iberian union were carried out over several years with meticulous care. Portuguese diplomats, operating from the busy port of Lisbon, understood the immense leverage they held. Spain needed Portuguese gold to stabilize its economy, and Charles needed a capable regent to govern Spain during his long, unavoidable absences on the European continent. The marriage treaty, finalized after extensive correspondence, included one of the largest dowries in historical memory, a massive transfer of wealth that immediately brought relief to the imperial finances. In the spring of 1526, the wedding took place in the grand historic city of Seville. The celebration was designed to be a masterpiece of diplomatic theatre, a public display of unity between the two greatest seafaring powers of the age. Yet beneath the grand public ceremonies and the formal state banquets, a remarkably deep and genuine partnership began to form between Charles and Isabella. During their brief months together in the beautiful quiet gardens of the Alcazar of Seville, away from the constant pressure of imperial councils, they established a profound mutual understanding. When Charles was called away once more to manage the complex political landscape of Central Europe, he left Isabella with full governing powers as regent of Spain. For years she managed the internal affairs of the kingdom with a firm, intelligent hand, securing the borders, managing the turbulent nobility, and ensuring that the financial heart of the empire continued to beat steadily. This quiet internal consolidation allowed the Habsburg-Portuguese alliance to serve as an anchor of stability in Western Europe. While the rest of the continent faced deep religious and political transformations, the Iberian Peninsula remained peaceful, its resources protected by the unspoken strength of a single marriage contract. Yet as Isabella ruled quietly from the palaces of Toledo, the strain of managing such a vast empire began to cast a long, quiet shadow over the royal household, leaving the future of this grand continental alliance balancing on a delicate thread of health, distance and time. All stories on this channel's Sleepy History with Benedict are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events. Figures and periods reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. Let us leave the continental plains for a moment and journey across the misty waters of the English Channel, arriving on an island kingdom that had spent decades tearing itself apart from within. This was England in the late 15th century, a land of ancient forests, fertile valleys and fortified castles, all deeply scarred by the protracted civil conflicts known to history as the Wars of the Roses. For generations, two rival branches of the royal Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster, represented by the Red Rose, and the House of York, represented by the White Rose, had engaged in a bitter struggle for the English crown. The constant shifting of power had left the English nobility decimated, the economy stagnant, and the common people exhausted by uncertainty. The stability of the state was practically non-existent, as kings were crowned and deposed in rapid succession. It was against this backdrop of division that a young exile, Henry Tudor, returned to England to claim the throne under the Lancastrian banner. But Henry, a cautious and deeply pragmatic leader, understood a vital political truth. Winning a crown on a field of conflict was not the same as keeping it. To truly rule a divided nation, he needed to heal the fracture that ran through the very heart of the kingdom. The solution lay in a quiet, diplomatic arrangement that would prove far more durable than any treaty signed under duress. Henry pledged to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of the late Yorkist King Edward IV. Elizabeth was a figure of immense symbolic importance. To many in England, she represented the legitimate lineage of the Yorkist cause. A union between Henry and Elizabeth would not just be a marriage, it would be a literal weaving together of two warring factions. In January 1486, the wedding was celebrated in the quiet majesty of Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was intentionally designed to showcase unity and reconciliation. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York were artistically blended into a single unified emblem, the Tudor Rose. This new symbol, carved into the stone walls of palaces and woven into courtly tapestries, sent a powerful, non-verbal message to the entire kingdom that the era of dynastic friction was officially over. Beyond the symbolism, the marriage subtly reshaped England's position within the broader European landscape. A stable, unified England allowed Henry VII to focus on rebuilding the royal treasury and establishing secure diplomatic relationships with continental powers like Spain and France. By removing the threat of domestic rebellion through family alliance, The English monarchy could finally step out of its internal isolation and begin participating as a major player in international diplomacy. If you're enjoying this quiet journey through the hidden corners of history and finding a sense of peace in these stories, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a gentle like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your quiet support helps us continue creating this peaceful space for learning and rest. In the quiet chambers of the palace, Henry and Elizabeth established a court focused on financial prudence and structural stability. Their marriage, built initially on political necessity, grew into a partnership of quiet respect. Yet beneath the calm surface of the newly unified kingdom, the ghosts of the old conflicts still lingered in the shadows, and the survivors of the deposed factions watched from a distance, waiting to see if this fragile, beautiful Tudor peace would survive the tests of a changing world. The consolidation of the Tudor dynasty within the borders of England opened the door for a much grander ambition, establishing a permanent foothold in the high-stakes arena of continental diplomacy. King Henry VII, ever the cautious accountant of power, knew that his family was still viewed by older European houses as a collection of wealthy upstarts. To secure his line and elevate England's status, he looked toward the most powerful, glittering monarchy of the age, the unified kingdoms of Spain, ruled by Isabella and Ferdinand. The prize was a marriage between Henry's eldest son and heir, Arthur, the Prince of Wales, and the youngest daughter of the Spanish monarchs, Catherine of Aragon. Negotiations began when the children were mere toddlers, conducted through heavy leather volumes of diplomatic correspondence that travelled back and forth across the sea for over a decade. The treaty, meticulously drafted, promised a massive Spanish dowry and, more importantly, unbreakable military and political alliance that would counter the influence of France. In the autumn of 1501, a young Catherine set sail from the sun-drenched coast of Andalusia, leaving behind the fragrant orange groves and brilliant light of her childhood home to face the cold, mist-shrouded landscapes of southern England. When she arrived in London, the city welcomed her with elaborate pageantry. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral was a masterpiece of dynastic theatre, signalling to all of Europe that the House of Tudor was now officially linked to the master weavers of the continent. But the calculations of monarchs are always at the mercy of human fragility. Merely 5 months after the wedding, the young Prince Arthur fell gravely ill at Ludlow Castle and passed away, leaving the diplomatic alliance suddenly hanging by a thread. The Spanish dowry had only been partially paid, and neither Henry VII nor Ferdinand of Aragon wished to see their carefully constructed geopolitical bridge collapse. In the quiet chambers of state, a radical and highly unusual solution was devised. It was proposed that Catherine should marry Arthur's younger brother, the newly elevated heir, Henry, the young man who would eventually become King Henry VIII. Because canon law strictly forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow, the diplomats had to appeal to Rome, initiating months of delicate, hushed negotiations to secure a special papal dispensation. When the young Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, one of his very first acts was to fulfill this political pledge and marry Catherine. In the early years of their reign, the union appeared to be an unmitigated success. Catherine brought a level of international prestige, intellectual refinement, and deep-rooted diplomatic connections to the English court that it had never possessed before. She acted not just as a queen, but as an effective ambassador for her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, ensuring that England remained a vital piece in the Habsburg geopolitical network. Yet, as the years passed quietly within the stone walls of Greenwich and Hampton Court, the immense political pressure for a male heir began to weigh heavily on the royal marriage. The continuous failure to produce a surviving son started to crack the elegant facade of the alliance. What had begun as a quiet masterstroke of European diplomacy was slowly turning into a deeply personal and political crisis, one that would eventually push Henry VIII to question the very foundations of his marriage. setting England on a path toward a historic break with Rome that no diplomat could have ever foreseen. Let us now let our minds drift away from the damp maritime air of the British Isles, travelling eastward across the vast, rolling plains of Central Europe where the rivers flow broad and slow toward the Baltic Sea. We arrive in the Grand Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a massive, culturally diverse commonwealth that, in the early 16th century, stood as a giant of the East. Yet, despite its vast territory, the Jagiellonian dynasty faced growing geopolitical pressures, caught between the rising power of the Grand Duchy of Moscow to the east and the omnipresent, calculating web of the Habsburgs to the west. To fortify his kingdom's position and bring a new wave of modern administrative thought to his court, the aging King Sigismund I sought a matrimonial alliance that would connect Poland to the vibrant, wealthy heart of the Italian Renaissance. The choice fell upon Bona Sforza, a daughter of the powerful House of Sforza of Milan and the royal House of Aragon. Bona was a young woman raised in the highly sophisticated, intensely competitive atmosphere of the Italian city-states, a world where diplomacy, financial acumen, and art were deeply intertwined. In the spring of 1518, Bona Sforza arrived in the historic Polish capital of Krakow, a grand procession winding up the Whatwell Hill under a clear European sky. She brought with her an unimaginable dowry of Italian gold, but more importantly she brought a revolutionary vision for the structure of royal power. To the traditional Polish nobility, who were accustomed to a weak monarchy and vast personal freedoms, the arrival of this sharp-minded Italian princess was a quiet, systemic shock. Bona understood that true political independence required independent financial strength. Instead of relying on the taxes voted by a reluctant parliament, she quietly began a massive, systematic program of land domestic reform. Using her personal wealth and her sharp understanding of economic management, she bought back mortgaged royal estates, drained vast marshlands to create arable farmland, and established new towns and manufacturing centres across Poland and Lithuania. Her influence extended deeply into the realm of foreign policy. Bona viewed the expansion of the Habsburgs with immense caution, and she used her diplomatic correspondence to weave a quiet counter-alliance, maintaining close, peaceful ties with the Ottoman Empire and France to balance the continental scales. She transformed the Wawel Castle into a glowing hub of Renaissance culture, introducing Italian architecture, literature, and even modern agricultural techniques and vegetables to the northern plains, forever altering the daily life and landscape of her new home. Yet this quiet economic and political centralization created a deep unspoken friction within the kingdom. The Polish barons and nobles watched the Queen's growing financial independence with escalating anxiety. Realizing that her quiet administrative reforms were systematically shifting the balance of power away from their provincial estates and back toward the central crown. As the years lengthened and her influence over the king deepened, a silent, ideological Cold War began to take shape within the stone chambers of Krakow, a delicate standoff between the ancient traditions of the north and the modern calculated statecraft of the Mediterranean. Let us journey back toward the west, into the fertile valleys and limestone chateaux of France. In the early decades of the 16th century, the Kingdom of France found itself locked in a grueling, multi-generational rivalry with the massive Habsburg Empire of Charles V. The French king, Francis I, realized that to break the imperial encirclement, he needed two things: immense financial resources and a strong geopolitical foothold on the Italian peninsula. The solution arrived not through a military expedition across the Alps, but through a calculated matrimonial alliance that shocked the old aristocratic houses of Europe. In 1533, Francis I arranged the marriage of his second son, Henri, to a young orphan girl from Florence, Catherine de' Medici, to the ancient nobility of France. Catherine was dismissively labelled as the merchant's daughter, a woman from a family of upstart bankers who lacked the noble bloodlines of traditional royalty. But what the Medici lacked in ancient lineage, they more than made up for in liquid wealth, political cunning, and a deep understanding of banking networks. When the 14-year-old Catherine arrived in the bustling port of Marseille, she was accompanied by her uncle, Pope Clement VII, who had personally negotiated the union. Her dowry was astronomical, providing the French crown with a massive injection of gold that helped fund state expenditures and stabilize the royal treasury during a period of intense economic strain. For the first 2 decades of her marriage, Catherine remained a quiet, almost invisible figure at the French court. She lived in the long shadow of her husband's famous mistress, Diane de Poitiers, and was largely excluded from the formal councils of state. Yet beneath this submissive and patient facade, Catherine was observing everything. She studied the intricate factions of the French nobility, learned the art of political survival in a hostile environment, and maintained a private, extensive network of diplomatic correspondence with her contacts in Italy. She introduced to the French court a highly sophisticated Florentine style of diplomacy, one that relied heavily on subtle observation, information gathering, and cultural influence. While her husband Henri II eventually ascended the throne and focused on traditional military strategies, Catherine quietly built an internal base of support among humanists, diplomats, and artists, transforming the royal court into a space where political power was managed through subtle social navigation rather than raw force. If you're finding comfort and inspiration in these late-night historical journeys, please take a gentle moment to hit the like button and subscribe to Sleepy History with Benedict. Your quiet presence in our community helps us craft more peaceful, educational narratives to soothe your mind before sleep. As the years drifted by, the quiet, overlooked Italian princess became an indispensable anchor of the Valois dynasty. Her marriage had successfully woven the immense financial power of Florence into the fabric of the French monarchy, providing France with the structural resilience needed to maintain its balance against the Habsburg giant. Yet the true depth of Catherine's political mind was still hidden from the world, and the volatile currents of French politics were slowly drifting toward a dark, unpredictable horizon that would test her quiet resilience to its absolute limit. Let us now turn our gaze away from the grand palaces of Western Europe, directing our thoughts northward, where the air grows crisp and the dark waters of the Baltic and North Seas meet. We travel back to the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a time when the Scandinavian landscape was defined by vast pine forests, deep fjords, and fierce maritime trade. Here, a remarkable political architect, Queen Margaret I of Denmark, was quietly orchestrating a masterstroke of dynastic consolidation that would unite the entire Nordic world under a single formidable banner. For generations, the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had existed in a state of fragile coexistence, frequently locked in territorial friction and vulnerable to the economic dominance of the German Hanseatic League. Margaret, possessing a rare geopolitical mind, understood that individual northern states could not withstand the rising merchant empires of the south. She envisioned a grand, unified northern superpower, the Kalmar Union, to cement this fragile structure and bring international legitimacy to her newly unified realm. She looked across the sea to the rising Kingdom of England. The diplomatic solution was a marriage between Margaret's grandnephew and chosen heir, Eric of Pomerania, who held the triple crowns of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and Princess Philippa of England, the daughter of King Henry IV. The negotiations were conducted through long winter months, with emissaries travelling back and forth across the turbulent North Sea. The English crown sought a powerful northern ally to secure its trade routes, while the Nordic Union required English diplomatic backing to counter German influence in the Baltic. In the autumn of 1406, the young Philippa arrived in the historic city of Lund to be wed to King Eric. The marriage was far more than a grand ceremonial display. It was the structural keystone of the Kalmar Union. Philippa proved to be an exceptionally capable and intelligent ruler. During the long periods when her husband Eric was away managing military campaigns or travelling through his vast territories, Philippa was granted full administrative authority, effectively governing the three northern kingdoms from the castle of Copenhagen. She stabilized the regional currency, established vital economic treaties with merchant guilds, and successfully defended the capital against foreign maritime blockades using her sharp strategic intellect. Under her quiet guidance, the marriage transformed the Scandinavian courts into a centralized modern administrative network, blending English legal concepts with traditional Nordic governance. This single union effectively turned the fractured kingdoms of the north into a unified empire that controlled the vital maritime gateways of Europe. Yet, as the quiet years of her administration passed, the immense structural strain of holding three fiercely independent nations under one central authority began to show its cracks. The distant Swedish nobility and Norwegian landholders grew increasingly restless under the centralized Danish administration, watching the Queen's efficient reforms with a mixture of respect and growing wariness. The Great Northern Peace, sealed at the altar, now stood as a magnificent but fragile shield against an uncertain future, leaving the destiny of Scandinavia balancing on the delicate edge of regional loyalties. Let us return once again to the heart of France, stepping into the late 16th century, where the air in the halls of Paris was heavy with tension, intrigue, and the scent of turning tides. The kingdom was no longer the unified power it had once been. Instead, it was deeply fractured by the wars of religion, a bitter and protracted ideological struggle between the dominant Catholic majority and the rising, determined Protestant minority, known as the Huguenots. The stability of the realm was collapsing, and the Valois monarchy, guided by the aging Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici, looked desperately for a way to bind the broken pieces of the state together without further ruin. The grand diplomatic solution devised in the quiet rooms of the Louvre was a marriage that shocked contemporaries by its sheer audacity. It was arranged that the king's sister, Margaret of Valois, a highly educated and fiercely independent Catholic princess, would marry Henry of Bourbon, the young King of Navarre, and the undisputed political leader of the Protestant faction. This union was designed to be the ultimate act of national reconciliation, a symbolic bridge across the deep religious chasm that divided the French people. In August 1572, the wedding took place in Paris, drawing thousands of noblemen from both factions into the city. Because the groom was a Protestant, he could not enter the great cathedral of Notre Dame for the religious service. Instead, the vows were exchanged on a specially constructed wooden platform outside the cathedral gates, under the open sky. To the observers of the time, it was a moment of profound visual poetry. It effectively brought the independent, strategically vital southern kingdom of Navarre into the direct orbit of the French crown, secured the porous borders along the Pyrenees, and placed Henry of Bourbon directly in the line of succession for the French throne. This quiet alignment of lineages created a structural path that would eventually allow the House of Bourbon to rise to absolute prominence, reshaping French administration, economics, and international diplomacy for the next 2 centuries. If you find a sense of rest and quiet clarity in these journeys through the turning points of the past, please take a gentle moment to leave a like. Subscribe to Sleepy History with Benedict and share your thoughts in the comments. Your peaceful presence here helps our channel grow and continue providing a calm space for learning and relaxation. Yet as the wedding celebrations filled the streets of Paris with music, poetry, and grand tournaments, the underlying hatreds between the two religious factions did not instantly dissolve. The presence of so many heavily armed rival nobles within the city walls created a volatile, unpredictable atmosphere. The quiet peace sealed at the altar was surrounded by a sea of whispers, shifting loyalties and hidden motives. leaving the young newlyweds to navigate a dangerous political landscape where the next chapter of French history was being written in the absolute darkest shadows of the palace. Let us leave the 16th century behind and drift forward into the late 17th century, where the political landscape of Europe was dominated by the grand, sun-like ambition of Louis XIII of France. As French armies marched toward the Rhine and French diplomacy sought to establish absolute hegemony over the continent, the rest of Western Europe recognized that their independent survival depended on building a unified, counterbalancing coalition. The key to this defensive web lay in a quiet, cross-channel marriage that would permanently realign the destinies of Great Britain and the Dutch Republic. At the centre of this geopolitical manoeuvre was William III of Orange, the stadtholder of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. William was a man of intense focus, quiet demeanour and singular purpose. To protect his homeland and the Protestant states of Europe from French expansion, to secure a permanent, unbreakable alliance with England, which was currently oscillating between French influence and domestic instability, William turned his attention toward Princess Mary Stuart, the eldest daughter of James, Duke of York, and niece to King Charles II. In November 1677, the wedding was celebrated with quiet understatement in London. To many casual observers at the time, it appeared as a standard diplomatic gesture. Mary was not just a foreign princess, she was a major heir to the English, Scottish and Irish thrones. By marrying her, William had quietly inserted himself directly into the internal political architecture of Great Britain. The profound weight of this alliance became clear 11 years later, in 1688, when England faced a deep political and religious crisis. The English Parliament reached across the sea to the Dutch stadtholder and his Stuart wife. In the historic event known as the Glorious Revolution, William and Mary were invited to ascend the throne as joint monarchs, the only co-rulers in British history. This historic transition was made structurally possible and politically legitimate because of the marriage vows they had exchanged over a decade earlier. The union of William and Mary completely inverted the balance of power in Western Europe. It instantly brought the immense maritime wealth, financial innovations and naval power of the Dutch Republic into a permanent, unified axis with the rising industrial and geopolitical strength of England. This quiet diplomatic convergence created an economic and military juggernaut that successfully checked French ambitions, establishing a new European status quo that would safeguard the balance of power for generations to come. Yet, as the newly crowned monarchs sat together in the quiet chambers of Whitehall, navigating the complex laws of their dual inheritance, they understood that the alliance they had forged was as fragile as it was powerful. They had unified two distinct maritime cultures, but the internal political currents of both nations remained deeply volatile, leaving the newly established British-Dutch axis to stand as a magnificent but untested fortress against the winds of an unwritten future. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. Let us leave the maritime shores of England and Holland behind, letting our minds drift deep into the vast, snow-covered forests and grand stone palaces of Eastern Europe. We arrive in the mid-18th century within the glittering, candle-lit chambers of St. Petersburg, a city rising like a magnificent mirage from the marshlands of the Neva River. Here, the Russian Empire, expanded and modernized by Peter the Great, was seeking to anchor its growing influence within the traditional diplomatic networks of Central and Western Europe. The ruling Empress Elizabeth of Russia faced a profound dynastic challenge, securing the succession of the Romanov line while ensuring that the empire remained protected from the shifting alliances of its rivals, Prussia and Austria. Her chosen heir was her young nephew Peter, a prince of German descent who felt little natural affection for his new homeland. To stabilize his position and bring a stabilizing influence into the Grand Court, Elizabeth initiated a careful, continent-wide search for a suitable royal bride. The choice fell not upon a princess from a dominant superpower, but upon a young woman from a minor, impoverished German principality, Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst. To the Russian court, this choice appeared highly strategic. A princess from a small state would bring no complicated foreign obligations, making her easier to mould into a compliant instrument of the Russian crown. In 1744, the young Sophia made the long, grueling journey across the frozen European plains to St. Petersburg, arriving in a world that felt completely foreign in its language, customs, and deep religious traditions. But Sophia possessed a rare quiet brilliance and an iron determination that no one at court had anticipated. She understood immediately that her survival and future power depended on complete integration. She spent her nights memorizing Russian grammar, studying the complex history of her new nation, and eventually converting to the Russian Orthodox Church, adopting the name Catherine. When the wedding was celebrated with quiet grandeur in August 1745, it was viewed by diplomats as a routine dynastic link designed to keep Russia quietly aligned with the northern German states. The structural consequences of this union, however, completely rewrote the geopolitical landscape of the entire century. Catherine's presence at the heart of the Romanov dynasty transformed the Russian court into a highly sophisticated center of European philosophy, art, and administrative innovation. Instead of remaining an isolated northern power, Russia's internal stability, managed through Catherine's sharp administrative intellect, allowed the empire to project its power deeply into the affairs of Central Europe, partitioning territories and reshaping borders with unprecedented authority. Yet behind the elegant facade of the imperial marriage, a deep and unbridgeable personal rift was opening between Catherine and her husband Peter. While Peter isolated himself and grew increasingly unpopular with the military and nobility, Catherine quietly built her own independent networks of communication, corresponding with global thinkers and securing the loyalty of key political figures in St. Petersburg. The quiet marriage that was intended to provide a submissive bride for a Romanov heir had instead placed a master political strategist at the very steps of the throne, leaving the future of the entire Russian Empire balancing on the quiet, unexpressed ambitions of a single woman. Let us gently steer our thoughts back to the grand palaces of Western Europe, where the mid-18th century was witnessing a profound, almost unimaginable transformation in the traditional chessboard of international diplomacy. For more than 2 centuries, the geopolitical landscape of the continent had been fundamentally anchored by a deep, unwavering rivalry between 2 titanic dynasties, the House of Bourbon in France and the House of Habsburg in Austria. Generation after generation, these 2 giants had matched each other move for move, locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance over Central Europe. But as the currents of history shifted, a new and aggressive power began to rise from the northern plains, the Kingdom of Prussia. Recognizing this shared threat, the brilliant Austrian Empress, Maria Theresa, initiated a radical diplomatic pivot that historians would later call the Diplomatic Revolution. To seal this unprecedented truce, and secure a lasting peace between the historic rivals, she proposed the ultimate structural bond, the marriage of her youngest daughter, the Archduchess Maria Antonia, to the heir to the French throne, the young Louis Auguste, Duke of Berry. In the spring of 1770, the young Austrian princess, who would forever be known to history as Marie Antoinette, began her monumental journey toward her new destiny. At the border island on the Rhine River, a symbolic ceremony of transition took place. She was stripped of her Austrian clothing, her possessions, and even her childhood companions, completely transformed into a French Dauphine before setting foot on French soil. When she arrived at the breathtaking, candlelit palace of Versailles, the wedding was celebrated with unparalleled magnificence. designed to broadcast a message of unbreakable Franco-Austrian solidarity to every watching court in Europe. Beyond the astonishing luxury of the court banquets and the theatrical displays of fireworks, this marriage completely inverted the Continental Alliance system. The long-standing hostility between Paris and Vienna vanished overnight, replaced by a dense network of economic, military, and diplomatic cooperation. This new Bourbon-Habsburg axis effectively isolated Prussia, stabilized the vulnerable borders of Central Europe, and allowed both France and Austria to redirect their strategic attention toward maritime trade and expanding global interests. Yet within the gilded, mirrored halls of Versailles, this quiet geopolitical masterstroke was met with deep, lingering suspicion by the French public and segments of the ancient nobility. To many traditionalists, Austria remained the old enemy, and the young Dauphin was frequently viewed not as a symbol of peace, but as a foreign agent placed at the heart of the French state. As the young couple navigated the immense social pressures and rigid etiquettes of the court, a silent undercurrent of tension began to ripple through the palace, leaving this historic continental alliance balancing on a beautiful but immensely fragile foundation of public perception and courtly intrigue. Let us leave the 18th century behind and step into the 19th century, an era defined by the steady hum of industrial steam, the expansion of global trade networks, and the rise of a new constitutional order. In Great Britain, the long and stable reign of Queen Victoria had established the British Empire as the undisputed economic anchor of the globe. Yet, looking across the North Sea, British diplomats and the royal household watched the rapid, unpredictable evolution of the German states with intense focus, realizing that the future stability of Western Europe depended on guiding this rising continental power toward a path of peaceful integration. The strategic solution devised by Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert was a long-term diplomatic marriage that they hoped would quietly shape the ideological destiny of a unified Germany. They arranged the union of their eldest daughter Victoria, the Princess Royal, known affectionately as Vicky, to Prince Frederick William of Prussia, the young man destined to inherit the Prussian crown. Prince Albert, a visionary committed to liberal constitutional ideals, believed that this marriage would insert British progressive values directly into the heart of the traditional conservative Prussian military elite. In January 1858, the wedding was celebrated in the quiet majesty of the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. To the global diplomatic community, this union was recognized as a massive structural bridge between the world's greatest naval empire and Central Europe's most formidable military state. Vicky brought with her not only a substantial British dowry, but an exceptional intellectual capacity, a deep understanding of constitutional governance, and a personal mission to foster an enduring, peaceful alliance between London and Berlin. During the early decades of their union, the young couple established a court that became an intellectual sanctuary for liberal thinkers, reformist politicians, and artists who envisioned a modern, united Germany that ruled through economic innovation and educational excellence, rather than raw military force. This quiet domestic alliance created a highly effective diplomatic channel between the British and Prussian governments, allowing for a steady, peaceful exchange of strategic intelligence and mutual support during complex international negotiations. Yet, as the years lengthened, this beautiful progressive vision began to collide with the cold, unyielding reality of Prussian internal politics. The rise of Otto von Bismarck, the pragmatic and formidable minister-president of Prussia, systematically marginalized the liberal influence of the young royal couple. Bismarck sought to unify Germany not through constitutional agreements or family alliances, but through blood and iron statecraft. In the quiet chambers of the Berlin palaces, Vicky and her husband found themselves increasingly isolated, caught in a delicate, high-stakes ideological struggle against a rising tide of fierce militarism that threatened to sweep away the peaceful, constitutional future they had spent their entire lives trying to construct. Let us transition our thoughts into the twilight of the 19th century, an era where the old dynastic networks of Europe were entering their final, most intricate phase of systemic alignment. The continent was now divided into a complex web of mutual defense pacts, and the traditional great powers were looking closely at the smaller, strategically vital border states that controlled the waterways and trade routes of southeastern Europe. Among these, the Kingdom of Romania stood as a critical geographic pivot, a gateway situated at the volatile crossroads between the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. To anchor this young Balkan kingdom firmly within the mainstream of Western European diplomacy and protect its sovereignty from neighbouring imperial pressures, a marriage was arranged that would bring the highest tier of global royalty to the banks of the Danube. The union connected Prince Ferdinand, the heir to the Romanian throne, with Princess Marie of Edinburgh. Marie was a figure of unparalleled dynastic significance. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain through her father, and the granddaughter of Tsar Alexander II of Russia through her mother, carrying the dual heritage of the world's most formidable maritime and continental empires. In January 1893, the wedding was celebrated with quiet dignity in the historic castle of Sigmaringen. This marriage was a masterstroke of defensive diplomacy for Romania. By placing a princess of British and Russian royal blood at the heart of the state, Romania effectively established an invisible international shield around its borders. Marie brought with her an extraordinary personal charisma, a sharp understanding of geopolitical strategy, and an extensive, private network of diplomatic correspondence that bypassed the formal, often rigid channels of traditional ministries. As the early years of her marriage unfolded within the quiet, mountain-ringed palace of Peles, Marie worked systematically to elevate Romania's position on the international stage. She recognized that the old European balance of power was shifting, and she used her family connections in London and St. Petersburg to slowly, quietly reorient Romanian foreign policy away from its historical dependencies and toward a closer relationship with the rising Western alliance. Her presence transformed the regional court into a highly influential diplomatic hub, where the interests of the great powers were carefully balanced against the sovereign ambitions of the Balkan state. Yet this quiet realignment of loyalties created an atmosphere of deep, unspoken friction within the region's political circles. The neighbouring empires watched the Queen's growing diplomatic independence with escalating anxiety, understanding that her quiet, family-driven statecraft was systematically pulling a vital strategic territory out of their traditional spheres of influence. As the new century dawned and the rumblings of a broader European conflict began to echo from a distance, the quiet alliance sealed at the altar stood as a bold but fragile fortress, leaving the ultimate destiny of the entire region balancing on the quiet resolve and unwritten choices of a single determined queen. Let us draw our attention back to the misty waters of the North Sea, filtering through the complex web of 19th century maritime diplomacy. As the European continent continued to industrialize at a breathtaking pace, the strategic control of shipping lanes, coastal fortresses, and naval access points became the ultimate obsession of prime ministers and monarchs alike. Great Britain, operating from its position of global naval supremacy, recognized that it could no longer rely solely on industrial dominance to keep the continent stable. It needed to plant deep, quiet roots within the royal houses that guarded the gateways to the Baltic Sea. The diplomatic opportunity crystallized in the early 1860s through the arranged marriage of Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales and heir to the British throne, to Princess Alexandra of Denmark. Alexandra came from a lineage that, while not matching the immense wealth of the British Empire, held a position of profound strategic importance. Denmark was the literal keeper of the Baltic Straits, a geographic buffer zone positioned directly between the British sphere of maritime interest and the rapidly expanding, highly aggressive military power of Prussia. In March 1863, the wedding was celebrated within the historic, stone-carved walls of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. To the outside world, it was an occasion of immense romantic celebration and public adulation. The grace and poise of the young Danish princess completely captivated the British public. But within the quiet, leather-bound offices of the Foreign Office, the union was viewed as a vital defensive realignment. The marriage effectively brought the Danish royal family into an unbreakable protective relationship with London, sending a clear, non-verbal warning to continental powers that any attempt to disrupt the balance of power in the northern seas would be met with British resistance. Alexandra proved to be far more than a symbolic figurehead at the English court, possessing a quiet, unyielding devotion to her homeland. She used her position of immense social influence to continuously guide British aristocratic and political opinion. Through a lifetime of private, highly confidential correspondence with her sister, who had married into the Russian Romanov dynasty, and her brother, who was placed on the throne of Greece, Alexandra helped weave an informal, highly resilient family network that bypassed traditional diplomatic channels. This quiet pan-European alliance of siblings acted as a persistent counterweight to Prussian ambitions, keeping the lines of communication between London, Copenhagen and St. Petersburg completely open. Yet this family-driven statecraft operated in an environment of escalating international tension. The rapid rise of the German Empire under the guidance of its military strategists continued to exert tremendous pressure on the borders of Scandinavia. In the quiet chambers of Marlborough House, the young princess watched the horizon with a mixture of determination and profound concern, realizing that the protective shield her marriage had constructed was being tested by forces far more powerful than any dynastic agreement. The grand peace of the northern seas, sealed with a ring, remained a magnificent but fragile barrier against an unpredictable dawn, leaving the ultimate fate of the Baltic kingdoms balancing on the quiet, unyielding loyalties of a single household. Let us gently direct our thoughts southwestward, leaving the chilly winds of the North Sea behind to settle upon the sun-drenched, rugged coastlines of the Iberian Peninsula. We arrive in the Kingdom of Portugal during the mid-19th century, a maritime nation with a glorious history of global exploration, yet one that was deeply exhausted by recent domestic instability and the bitter aftermath of the liberal wars. The young Queen Maria II sat upon a fragile throne, surrounded by shifting political factions and watched closely by dominant foreign powers, who looked for any opportunity to expand their influence over the vital Atlantic ports of Lisbon and Porto. To secure the constitutional monarchy and protect the realm from external intervention, a diplomatic union was arranged with the most successful dynastic network of the era, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The choice fell upon Prince Ferdinand, a young man of exceptional cultural refinement, artistic talent, and deep administrative prudence. This house was already famous for its ability to place capable, constitutionally minded rulers on the thrones of Europe, maintaining a close and unbreakable alignment with the global interests of Great Britain. In April 1836, the wedding was celebrated with quiet elegance in the historic cathedral of Lisbon. Upon the birth of their first heir, Ferdinand was elevated to the status of King Guega, king consort, ruling alongside Maria as Ferdinand II. To the common observer, he was a monarch dedicated entirely to the restoration of grand architectural monuments and the promotion of the arts. But beneath this gentle scholarly facade lay a remarkably astute political mind. Ferdinand understood that his primary duty was to act as an anchor of stability for the Portuguese state. He worked systematically behind the scenes to bridge the bitter divides between the conservative nobility and the liberal reformists, managing the state councils with a firm, impartial hand during moments of severe government crisis. Through his private diplomatic correspondence with his uncle, King Leopold I of Belgium, and his cousin, Prince Albert of Great Britain, Ferdinand quietly linked the financial and political security of Portugal to the dominant economic networks of northern Europe. His administrative foresight ensured that Portuguese maritime trade routes remained protected and that the kingdom could modernize its infrastructure without sacrificing its sovereign independence. Yet, managing a state in a state of continuous transition was a task filled with silent friction. The radical factions within the parliament and the traditionalist landowners watched the foreign king stabilizing reforms with a mixture of appreciation and lingering defensiveness. Realizing that his quiet diplomacy was steadily binding the nation to an international constitutional order. Within the beautifully restored, mist-shrouded halls of the Peña Palace in Sintra, the royal family navigated the delicate balance of a changing world, leaving the long-term survival of the unified crown resting upon a fragile foundation of domestic trust and unspoken international alliances. Let us allow our journey to drift deep into the rugged limestone mountains of the Balkans, to a small, fiercely independent principality perched high above the sparkling waters of the Adriatic Sea, Montenegro. In the late 19th century, this mountainous realm sat directly within the geographic storm centre of European diplomacy, surrounded by the competing giant ambitions of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. The ruling house of Petrovich-Njegoš understood that military bravery alone could not guarantee their survival. They needed a permanent, unbreakable anchor attached directly to a superpower. The solution was found through a deliberate and highly effective matrimonial strategy that targeted the grandest court in the world, St. Petersburg. In July 1889, Princess Milica of Montenegro married Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich of Russia, a grandson of Tsar Nicholas I. A few years later, her sister Anastasia would also marry into the Russian royal family. To the traditional diplomats of Vienna and Constantinople, these unions appeared as simple, sentimental gestures by the Russian Tsars to support their fellow Slavic Orthodox brethren in the south. But in reality, these weddings created a powerful, silent geopolitical pipeline. Milica and her sister, known at the Russian court as the Black Princesses, became exceptionally influential figures within the inner circles of the Romanov dynasty. They established a quiet, private network of communication that connected the remote mountain fortresses of Montenegro directly to the winter palaces of Russia. Through this confidential channel, vital intelligence regarding military movements, diplomatic shifts, and political currents in the Balkans flowed steadily back and forth, completely bypassing the formal, easily monitored bureaucratic ministries. This quiet matrimonial alliance effectively transformed Montenegro from an isolated Balkan state into a crucial geopolitical outpost for Russia. It guaranteed Russian financial subsidies, modern military equipment, and absolute diplomatic protection for the small principality, while giving St. Petersburg a permanent, loyal lever to influence the complex politics of southeastern Europe. This alignment profoundly disrupted the plans of Austria-Hungary, which found its southern expansion systematically checked by the invisible, family-driven ties that linked the Adriatic coast to the Baltic plains. Yet this intense, secret statecraft operated on the edge of a dangerous precipice. The presence of the Montenegrin princesses at the centre of Russian power, and their passionate advocacy for the pan-Slavic cause, created deep anxiety among conservative Russian politicians who feared being dragged into a chaotic regional conflict. In the quiet, candlelit chambers of the palaces outside St. Petersburg, the network they had woven stood as a potent but volatile mechanism, leaving the peace of the entire European continent balancing on the quiet whispers and unyielding loyalties of a single family alliance. Let us travel back once more to the sweeping, mist-shrouded coastlines of northern Europe, where the final years of the 19th century were quietly setting the stage for a dramatic rewriting of Scandinavian sovereignty. For nearly a century, the Kingdom of Norway had existed in a reluctant, politically stifling union under the Swedish crown. However, beneath the quiet surface of this constitutional arrangement, A powerful current of national identity and a desire for complete sovereignty were building among the Norwegian people, waiting for the precise geopolitical moment to assert their independence. That moment arrived in the early years of the 20th century, but the transition required a deeply calculated dynastic anchor to ensure its international legitimacy. The solution had already been quietly prepared a decade earlier, in July 1896, through the wedding of Princess Maud of Wales, the youngest daughter of the future British King Edward VII, to her first cousin Prince Carl of Denmark. When Norway officially declared its independence from Sweden in 1905, the Norwegian Parliament turned to Prince Carl, inviting him to ascend their newly created throne as King Haakon VII, with Maud as his queen. The international implications of this choice were monumental. By electing a king whose wife was a British princess, the young Norwegian state instantly bound its political survival to the world's dominant maritime superpower. Maud's close, affectionate relationship with her father, King Edward VII, provided Norway with a direct, highly confidential channel of communication straight to the heart of the British government, ensuring immediate diplomatic recognition and protection during a highly volatile transition period. This marriage transformed Norway from a vulnerable northern territory into a critical strategic partner for Great Britain. It secured the vital shipping lanes of the North Sea and guaranteed that Norway's immense coastline and deep fjords would remain open to British trade, while being effectively shielded from the expansionist ambitions of continental empires. Maud brought the refined traditions of the British court to the quiet capital of Christiania, modern-day Oslo, establishing a modern, approachable monarchy that focused on domestic stability, environmental preservation and social welfare. Yet establishing a new dynasty in an era of rapid democratization and escalating international rivalry was a path filled with silent complications. The Republican factions within Norway and the suspicious political circles in neighbouring capitals watched the young royal family's quiet reforms with a mixture of scrutiny and deep apprehension, understanding that this Anglo-Danish alliance had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire Arctic region. Inside the quiet palaces of the north, the new monarchs faced the immense pressure of securing their lineage, leaving the future of the independent kingdom balancing on the delicate, unwritten relationships of a changing continent. Let us lower our sails and return once more to the warm, sun-dusted landscapes of the Iberian Peninsula, stepping into the opening decade of the 20th century. The Kingdom of Spain, having recently lost the final remnants of its once vast global empire in the Americas and Asia, found itself standing at a critical historical crossroads. The young King Alfonso XIII understood that for his nation to survive and modernize in an increasingly fractured Europe, Spain could no longer remain isolated behind the natural stone fortress of the Pyrenees. It desperately needed to realign its destiny with the dominant liberal empires of the West. The strategic bridge was constructed through a quiet, meticulously planned matrimonial alliance that connected Madrid directly to London. The choice fell upon Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, known affectionately as Ina, who was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. This union was designed by diplomats to be a masterpiece of geopolitical repositioning. By bringing a British princess to the throne of Madrid, Spain quietly signalled its departure from decades of strict neutrality, entering into an informal but powerful alignment with the Anglo-French diplomatic network. In May 1906, the wedding was celebrated in the historic city of Madrid. Beyond the grand public displays of international unity and the elegant gathering of European royalty, this marriage carried immense structural weight for the balance of power in the Mediterranean. It effectively secured the vital shipping lanes passing through the Straits of Gibraltar and facilitated a series of quiet, highly confidential agreements regarding colonial spheres of influence in North Africa. Victoria Eugenie brought the administrative expectations and cultural influence of the British court to the royal palace of Madrid, quietly supporting efforts to modernize Spain's naval infrastructure and educational systems. Yet this calculated convergence of lineages was introduced into a highly volatile domestic environment. The traditionalist factions within the Spanish court and the rising radical movements in industrial cities watched the British Queen's progressive influence with a mixture of suspicion and deep hostility. The quiet stability that the marriage was intended to secure was continuously challenged by internal political crises, leaving the young royal family to navigate an increasingly fragile path where the ancient As the candle light began to flicker in the grand reception rooms of Madrid, the alliance sealed at the altar stood as a bold, strategic move on a shifting continental chessboard. The network of dynastic marriages that had quietly reshaped Europe for centuries was now twisting into its most complex and fragile form yet, holding regional rivalries together by the finest threads of family loyalty, while the gathering dark clouds on the European horizon threatened to push these ancient bonds into a completely unwritten chapter of history. Let us leave the Mediterranean shores of Spain behind, letting our thoughts drift southeastward across the deep blue waters toward the ancient sun-baked expanses of the Middle East. We arrive in the opening decades of the 20th century, a time when the vast, centuries-old tapestry of the Ottoman Empire was beginning to fracture and dissolve under the relentless pressure of modern nationalism and global conflict. In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, the noble Hashemite dynasty, the traditional keepers of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, looked toward the shifting horizon, realizing they needed to forge a powerful internal stability if they were to lead their people into a new era of sovereignty. The structural anchor for this geopolitical transition was a quiet, traditional marriage arranged within the elite circles of the Hashemite family itself. In 1904, Prince Faisal, the son of the Grand Sharif of Mecca, was wed to his cousin, Huzaima bint Nasser. To casual foreign observers at the time, this union appeared to be a routine, traditional alignment designed to maintain family harmony. But in the volatile arena of desert diplomacy, this marriage was a masterstroke of internal consolidation, binding together influential tribal loyalties and unifying the core factions of the Hijaz region under a single, focused leadership. This internal unity became critical as the tides of global war reached the sands of the Middle East. During the historic Arab Revolt, which was heavily supported by British strategic interests and naval power, Faisal emerged as the brilliant military commander and diplomatic face of the Arab nation. Huzaima's quiet management of the domestic front and her deep understanding of tribal alliances allowed the Hashemite leadership to maintain absolute loyalty among the highly independent desert clans, transforming a scattered tribal movement into a cohesive, formidable military force. The structural consequences of this marriage completely rewrote the political map of the entire region. Following the collapse of Ottoman rule, Faisal's established legitimacy, anchored by his unified family alliance, allowed him to briefly ascend the throne of Syria and eventually to be crowned as the first king of modern Iraq. Huzaima, ruling as his queen in Baghdad, brought a refined dignity to the newly established court, helping to bridge the gap between ancient tribal traditions and the complex administrative requirements of a modern, institutional state. Yet establishing a new constitutional monarchy in the fertile valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates was a task filled with invisible friction. The competing ambitions of Western empires, the local religious factions, and the newly formed political parties watched the royal family's modernizing reforms with a mixture of intense scrutiny and growing restlessness. In the quiet chambers of the palaces in Baghdad, the air remained thick with changing loyalties and unwritten laws, leaving the destiny of the newly formed kingdom balancing delicately on the edge of a rapidly modernizing world. Let us travel across the vast expanses of the Asian continent, leaving the desert oasis kingdoms behind. to settle upon the mist-covered mountains and ancient royal palaces of the Far East, we arrive in the early decades of the 20th century within a region undergoing a profound and traumatic geopolitical realignment. The ancient peninsula of Korea, once known as the Hermit Kingdom and ruled for over 5 centuries by the proud Joseon dynasty, had recently been annexed into the rapidly expanding industrialized network of the Empire of Japan. In this tense, volatile environment, the authorities in Tokyo sought a permanent, structural mechanism to legitimize their continental dominance and assimilate the old Korean royal line. The diplomatic solution devised by the imperial strategists was a highly calculated, forced dynastic alliance that shocked traditionalists in both nations. In 1920, Crown Prince Yi-un, the last direct heir to the Korean imperial throne, was wed to Princess Masako of Nashimoto, a prominent member of the Japanese imperial cadet branches. To the public, the wedding was broadcasted as a grand symbol of regional unity, unbreakable bridge connecting 2 ancient cultures under a single imperial architecture. But beneath the celebratory facade, it was a profound act of political assimilation designed to absorb the Korean royal identity directly into the aristocratic hierarchy of Tokyo. Princess Masako, who would later adopt the Korean name Lee Bang-ja, found herself placed in an exceptionally difficult and heartbreaking diplomatic position. She was a woman of deep empathy and artistic refinement, yet she was viewed with intense suspicion by the Korean people as a symbol of foreign occupation, and with quiet disdain by conservative elements in Japan who opposed the mixing of imperial bloodlines. Despite these immense social pressures, she made a quiet, lifelong vow to transform her forced union into a genuine instrument of cultural preservation and social welfare. The structural impact of this marriage extended far beyond the immediate political goals of the annexation. Throughout the turbulent years of the 1920s and 1930s, the household of Prince Yi-un and Princess Masako functioned as a unique informal diplomatic sanctuary in Tokyo. Masako utilized her extensive networks within the Japanese imperial court to quietly advocate for the preservation of Korean cultural artifacts, royal traditions, and historical archives that were threatened with destruction. Her quiet diplomacy provided a rare, protective shield for the remaining members of the Joseon lineage, maintaining a delicate thread of historical continuity during an era of aggressive cultural suppression. Yet, managing an identity split between 2 historically colliding nations was a task filled with persistent, silent sorrow. As the geopolitical landscape of East Asia began to fracture under the weight of escalating militarism and global conflict, the young couple understood that the symbolic bridge they had constructed was balanced on a highly unstable foundation. In the quiet wood-panelled rooms of their residence, the air remained heavy with unexpressed longings and changing loyalties, leaving the ultimate legacy of their historic union to face the unpredictable, sweeping winds of a modern world rushing toward a point of no return. Let us navigate our thoughts southward, leaving the mountain kingdoms of the Far East behind, to immerse ourselves in the vibrant, spice-scented air and sun-drenched marble palaces of the Indian subcontinent. We arrive in the turbulent decade of the 1940s, an era defined by the steady dismantling of global empires and the rapid, unpredictable birth of modern democratic nations. Across the vast landscape of British India, hundreds of semi-independent princely states, ruled for generations by proud Maharajas, Nawabs, and princes, watched the approaching horizon with deep anxiety, realizing that their sovereign survival depended on forging grand internal alliances before the old colonial architecture collapsed entirely. At the center of this protective statecraft was an extraordinary matrimonial alliance that united 2 of the most powerful and historic Maratha dynasties on the subcontinent. In April 1942, Prince Fateh Singh Rao Gaikwad, the young heir to the immense wealth and progressive administration of the Kingdom of Baroda, was wed to Princess Padmavati Rajay Scindia, a prominent daughter of the ruling house of Gwalior. To external British observers, the wedding appeared as a magnificent display of traditional pageantry and aristocratic luxury, but within the inner council chambers of central and western India, this union was recognised as a massive structural consolidation of regional power. The alliance bridged two territories known for their advanced infrastructure, independent militaries, and immense financial institutions. Fateh Singh was an exceptionally forward-thinking young leader, educated in constitutional law and global economics, while Padmavati brought a deep understanding of traditional diplomacy and courtly administrative network from Gwalior. Together, their combined household established a highly influential political bloc that could negotiate with both the departing British administration and the rising independence leaders of the Indian National Congress from a position of absolute unified strength. The structural consequences of this marriage became clearly evident in 1947, during the historic integration of the princely states into the newly independent Union of India. Rather than resisting the democratic transition and risking violent fracturing, the unified influence of the Baroda-Gwalior axis allowed for a remarkably peaceful, dignified transfer of administrative power. Fateh Singh used his consolidated status to quietly champion the preservation of regional cultural heritage, free education, and public health systems, successfully transition his traditional royal authority into a modern role as a democratic statesman, industrialist, and international sports diplomat. Yet redefining an ancient lineage to fit within the boundaries of a vast modern democratic republic was a path filled with deep, silent complexity. The traditionalist factions within the old royal courts and the radical political movements in the rapidly expanding cities watched the young couple's progressive reforms with a mixture of intense scrutiny and lingering suspicion. In the quiet, fan-cooled reception rooms of the Laxmi Vilas Palace, the air remained thick with changing constitutional laws and unwritten futures, leaving the ultimate legacy of their historic union to navigate the sweeping democratic currents of a completely transformed world. Let us cross the Arabian Sea and return to the cradle of civilization, settling into the momentous era just before the outbreak of the Second World War. The year is 1939, and the Middle East is witnessing a quiet but intense geopolitical race. Two of the region's largest, most ambitious powers, the ancient, oil-rich empire of Iran and the strategic Mediterranean kingdom of Egypt, are both seeking to modernize their societies while protecting their sovereignty from the tightening grip of British and Soviet spheres of influence. To construct an unyielding secular axis of Middle Eastern power, a grand dynastic alliance is proposed. The choice fell upon the Crown Prince of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the mesmerizingly beautiful Princess Fawzia Fuad, the sister of King Farouk of Egypt. This was not merely a romantic pairing, it was a deeply calculated diplomatic masterstroke. The Pahlavi dynasty in Iran was relatively new, lacking the deep historical pedigree that traditional international diplomacy often demanded. By marrying into the house of Muhammad Ali, which had ruled Egypt for over a century, the Iranian throne instantly secured unmatched regional prestige, combining Egypt's immense cultural capital with Iran's emerging strategic oil dominance. In March 1939, the wedding ceremonies began with absolute architectural grandeur, first in the historic palaces of Cairo, and then repeating with matching opulence in the ancient capital of Tehran. To global intelligence agencies and watching diplomats, this union shattered the traditional boundaries of regional politics. It forged a formidable Western-leaning Sunni-Shia alliance at a time when Europe was plunging into total chaos, effectively creating a unified geopolitical barrier that ran from the Nile Delta straight to the Persian Gulf. For a brief window, this imperial marriage transformed Tehran into a buzzing hub of international statecraft. Princess Fawzia, arriving with her refined French education and deep understanding of Western Mediterranean diplomacy, brought a modern, cosmopolitan energy to the conservative Iranian court. Her presence facilitated unique trade, educational and military agreements between Egypt and Iran, allowing the two nations to present a unified diplomatic front during the early volatile years of the global conflict, ensuring their oil fields and maritime lanes remained shielded from premature annexation. Yet behind the breathtaking press photographs and the elegant facade of the imperial palace, a quiet, unbridgeable cultural rift was widening between the young couple. Fawzia struggled deeply with the rigid isolation of the Tehran court and the harsh climate of the northern mountains, while the rising political instability within Iran placed immense domestic pressure on the young Shah. In the quiet, marble-lined chambers of the Niavaran palace, the air grew increasingly heavy with unexpressed homesickness and changing political tides, leaving the grand regional axis they had constructed to balance on a deeply fragile, fracturing foundation of personal happiness and shifting international loyalties. Let us sail back across the warm azure waters of the Mediterranean, letting our thoughts settle upon the sun-drenched, olive-fringed hills of the Kingdom of Greece. We arrive in the late 1930s, a fragile interwar period where the Balkan Peninsula was once again transforming into a dangerous geopolitical fault line. Surrounded by the expansionist, aggressive naval ambitions of fascist Italy and the unpredictable shifting allegiances of its northern neighbours, the Greek monarchy stood in desperate need of a powerful structural anchor, one that could quietly tie its destiny to the older, more stable constitutional networks of Northern Europe. The diplomatic solution materialised in January 1938 through a highly calculated union that bridged the Mediterranean with the ancient dynasties of Germany and Great Britain. Prince Paul, the heir presumptive to the Greek throne, was wed to Princess Frederica of Hanover. Frederica was a figure of exceptional dynastic weight. She was a granddaughter of the German Emperor Wilhelm II and a direct descendant of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. To watching diplomats in London and Berlin, this marriage was a high-stakes alignment, introduced precisely when both democratic and totalitarian powers were competing for strategic dominance over the Aegean shipping lanes. The wedding in Athens was celebrated with traditional Byzantine majesty, serving as a powerful message of international solidarity. Frederica brought to the Greek court an extraordinary, fierce intelligence, a commanding presence, and a direct line of communication to the most influential royal households in Europe. Her arrival instantly elevated the diplomatic status of the Greek crown, transforming the palace into a vital, discreet channel where British maritime interests and continental political currents could be carefully analysed and balanced against the immediate defence needs of the Greek state. Throughout the volatile opening months of the European crisis, this dynastic alliance functioned as an invisible protective shield. It allowed Greece to maintain deep, confidential diplomatic ties with Great Britain, securing vital promises of naval support and economic cooperation while navigating a highly precarious neutrality. Frederica's extensive family network provided the Greek leadership with real-time, behind-the-scenes insights into the true intentions of the continental powers, ensuring that the small Mediterranean kingdom was not left isolated as the old international order systematically collapsed around it. Yet holding a kingdom together on the absolute brink of a global conflagration was a task filled with suffocating, silent tension. The anti-monarchist factions within Greece and the hostile agents of neighbouring empires watched the young couple's growing diplomatic influence with deep suspicion, realizing that this Anglo-German-Greek axis had firmly locked the nation into a specific strategic trajectory. In the quiet, pine-scented gardens of the Tatoi Palace, the air grew heavy with the distant, unmistakable rumble of approaching warships, leaving the ultimate fate of the young dynasty to face the most destructive storm the modern world had ever known. Let us allow our journey to venture southward, crossing the Mediterranean and drifting deep into the lush, fertile heart of East Africa, along the shores of the great Lake Victoria. We arrive in the late 1940s, a profound historical moment where the entire African continent was beginning to stir with the restless, unstoppable spirit of anti-colonial resistance and national sovereignty. Within the British Protectorate of Uganda, the ancient proud kingdom of Buganda stood as the central economic and political engine of the territory. Its young monarch, Edward Mutesa II, known to the global press as King Freddie, understood that to protect his people's centuries-old autonomy from being dissolved into a centralized colonial administration, he needed to forge an unbreakable domestic alliance. The strategic solution was a meticulously calculated marriage that united the traditional mystique of the monarchy with the rising, highly educated political elite of the realm. In November 1948, King Mutesa II was wed to Damali Kisosonkole, a daughter of one of the most influential and progressive Christian administrative families in Buganda. To British colonial officials who watched the magnificent ceremony in the Grand Cathedral of Kampala, the union appeared to be a successful step toward modernization, a harmonious blending of ancient tribal kingship with Western education. But within the inner councils of the Mengo Palace, the marriage was recognized as a powerful act of domestic consolidation. Damali brought with her not only a refined intellect and deep diplomatic poise, but also the absolute loyalty of the powerful, modernizing factions within the Buganda parliament. This internal unity became an essential shield as the colonial office in London attempted to impose reforms that threatened to diminish Buganda's sovereign rights. When Mutesa II was later dramatically exiled to Britain by the colonial governor for refusing to compromise on his people's independence, the political network anchored by his marriage remained completely unyielding, organizing mass peaceful protests and maintaining absolute institutional stability across the kingdom. The structural impact of this dynastic alliance completely disrupted the calculations of the British Empire. The unyielding solidarity of the Buganda elite, solidified by the royal marriage, forced the colonial government to capitulate, bringing the king back from exile in absolute triumph. This historic victory positioned Mutesa II not just as a traditional ruler, but as a towering national figure, ultimately leading to his selection as the very first president of an independent Uganda in the early 1960s. With Damali serving as a highly respected, modernizing First Lady who championed women's education and healthcare, yet governing a newly born, complex, multi-ethnic republic in the dawn of the post-colonial era was a path filled with deep structural fractures. The fragile constitutional compromises between the traditional kingdoms and the radical secular political parties created an atmosphere of intense, escalating friction. In the quiet, breeze-cooled chambers of the palace in Entebbe, the air remained thick with unwritten political maneuvers and shifting military loyalties, leaving the ultimate survival of the ancient dynasty to face the sweeping, unpredictable storms of a completely transformed continent. Let us cross the vast, warm waters of the Indian Ocean, letting our journey drift into the tropical, emerald-green landscapes of Southeast Asia, down to the very tip of the Malayan Peninsula. We arrive in the momentous opening years of the 1940s, Buchan era, when the strategic shipping lanes of the Malacca Straits and the immense rubber and tin resources of the region made it a prize of ultimate obsession for competing global empires. Here sat the sovereign state of Johor, a fiercely independent and highly modernized, unfederated Malay state. Its ruler, Sultan Sir Abu Bakar, understood that maintaining his realm's fragile autonomy in the shadow of an approaching global war required an exceptional degree of international diplomatic adaptability. The matrimonial statecraft that crystallized during this period of extreme vulnerability was both unconventional and highly strategic. In October 1940, Sultan Abu Bakar was wed to Marcela Mendel, a brilliant and cosmopolitan European woman of Romanian aristocratic descent, who took the title of Sultana Marcela. To traditionalists and watching colonial administrators in Singapore, this international union was viewed with intense curiosity and geopolitical scrutiny. In reality, it provided the Johor crown with a unique, highly connected diplomatic asset, a queen who possessed a profound understanding of European political factions and a private network that extended far beyond the rigid, paternalistic channels of the British Colonial Office. This international perspective became absolutely vital as the storms of World War II violently swept through Southeast Asia. Sultana Marcella's sophisticated grasp of global affairs and her absolute devotion to her adopted homeland allowed the palace to navigate the treacherous shifting tides of foreign military occupation and subsequent British return. Together, the royal couple worked systematically behind the scenes to protect the local population, preserve the ancient Islamic laws of the state, and maintain the absolute integrity of the Johor military forces, ensuring that the infrastructure of native self-governance was never fully dismantled by external authorities. The structural consequences of this resilient dynastic management became profoundly clear in the post-war era as Malaya rapidly moved toward independence. The unbroken institutional stability of Johor, anchored by a forward-thinking and globally minded royal household, allowed the state to dictate terms during the formation of the modern Federation of Malaya. The Johor Crown successfully championed the preservation of traditional Malay sovereignty and constitutional monarchical rights, ensuring that the ancient royal houses would not be swept away by the winds of modernization, but would instead become the literal guardians of the new nation's constitutional identity. Yet anchoring an ancient, proud sultanate within the machinery of a rapidly developing, multi-ethnic democratic federation was a path filled with deep structural complexities. The delicate balance between federal authority and state rights, combined with the rising tide of radical socio-economic changes, created a landscape of persistent silent tension. Within the grand breeze-cooled halls of the Istana Besar in Johor Bahru, looking out across the narrow straits, the royal family stood as a vital but vulnerable bridge between two entirely different eras, leaving the ultimate destiny of their historic lineage to navigate the unwritten, sweeping currents of a rapidly awakening continent. Let us spread our wings and travel across the vast expanses of the Pacific, leaving the tropical sultanates of Southeast Asia behind, to settle upon the dramatic volcanic highlands and rich, fertile plantations of Central America. We arrive in the momentous closing years of the 1930s, within a region heavily dominated by the suffocating influence of foreign agricultural monopolies and rigid military dictatorships. In the Republic of Guatemala, a young, exceptionally brilliant military officer named Jacobo Arbenz looked at the deep poverty of his people and the absolute stagnation of his country. Realizing that any attempt to modernize the nation would require a powerful, highly intellectual domestic alliance capable of breaking the traditional chains of oligarchy, the structural anchor for this revolutionary political transition was a marriage that completely defied the expectations of Central American high society. In 1939, Jacobo Arbenz was wed to Maria Villanova, a highly educated, fiercely progressive young woman from one of the wealthiest, most aristocratic landowning families in neighboring El Salvador. To the elite circles of San Salvador and Guatemala City, the union appeared as a standard, elite alignment of military power and traditional wealth, but beneath the elegant surface, Maria was a woman of profound intellectual depth, deeply read in global economics, sociology, and political theory, who refused to accept the inequalities of her era. Maria Villanova became far more than a supportive spouse. She evolved into Arbenz's primary political strategist, intellectual collaborator, and independent advisor. Together, they formed a formidable ideological partnership that systematically prepared for a structural transformation of the Guatemalan state when the historic October Revolution of 1944 overthrew the old dictatorship. The unified clarity of their vision pushed Arbenz to the absolute forefront of national politics, ultimately leading to his landslide election as President of the Republic in 1950. With Maria acting as a highly active, politically astute First Lady, the administration launched a series of daring, unprecedented structural reforms. The most monumental of these was the historic Agrarian Reform Law, a strategic initiative deeply influenced and co-authored by Maria's extensive studies of successful global redistribution models. This law aimed to expropriate uncultivated lands from giant foreign corporations, specifically the powerful United Fruit Company, and redistribute them directly to hundreds of thousands of native indigenous peasants, transforming them into self-sufficient, capital-producing citizens. This bold matrimonial alliance had effectively turned the machinery of the state against the most powerful economic interests on the continent, asserting absolute economic sovereignty for the first time in modern Central American history, yet challenging the geopolitical dominance of a global superpower during the volatile dawn of the Cold War was a path filled with immense, terrifying dangers. The local conservative nobility, the nervous military officers, and foreign intelligence agencies watched the couple's radical modernizing program with a mixture of intense fury and growing paranoia, systematically labeling their nationalist reforms as an international security threat. In the quiet, wood-paneled offices of the National Palace in Guatemala City, the air grew increasingly thick with whispered conspiracies, shifting military loyalties and unwritten threats, leaving the ultimate survival of their progressive democracy to balance on a deeply fragile, precarious edge. Let us redirect our journey back across the Atlantic, leaving the turbulent highlands of Central America behind, to settle upon the ancient, sun-carved mountain peaks and fortress-like plateaus of the Horn of Africa. We arrive in the tense, momentous years of the mid-1930s, within the sovereign borders of the venerable empire of Ethiopia. As the last fully independent, uncolonized native nation on the African continent, Ethiopia stood as a magnificent symbol of black sovereignty worldwide. Yet, under the visionary rule of Emperor Haile Selassie, the empire was facing an existential crisis of unprecedented scale, as the aggressive, highly industrialized military machine of fascist Italy gathered along its northern and southern colonial borders, eagerly plotting a brutal invasion. To fortify the state against this looming external threat, a masterstroke of internal dynastic consolidation was orchestrated within the ancient capital of Addis Ababa. In 1934, the Crown Prince of Ethiopia, Asfor Wasson, was wed to Princess Medferiashwork. This union carried immense strategic weight for the internal cohesion of the empire. While the Crown Prince represented the ancient, prestigious Solomonic bloodline, Medferiashwork was the daughter of Rus Abebe Arigai, one of the most powerful, militarily capable, and widely respected aristocratic commanders of the Shon nobility, the literal warrior class that formed the iron backbone of the imperial army. This marriage was a calculated mechanism designed to eliminate decades of traditional regional rivalries and bind the independent provincial armies directly to the central authority of the imperial throne. Princess Medferiashwork brought to the royal court not only an exceptional cultural grace, but also the absolute, unyielding loyalty of the powerful Shon military elite. This internal solidarity became critical as the dark clouds of international diplomacy failed and the Italian forces launched their massive, illegal invasion of the country, deploying modern tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons against the traditional Ethiopian defenders. The structural impact of this dynastic alliance became profoundly visible during the dark years of the conflict and subsequent foreign occupation. While the emperor was forced to appeal to the League of Nations in Geneva, the marital alliance between the Crown Prince and the Shon nobility served as the core psychological and organizational anchor for the fierce, unyielding Ethiopian patriots movement. Operating from secret mountain caves and dense forests, the resistance networks connected to Medferiashwork's family systematically harassed the occupying forces, ensuring that the infrastructure of foreign rule remained unstable and that the native population never accepted the legitimacy of the conquest. Yet holding an ancient empire together under the relentless pressure of modern, industrialized warfare and deep domestic transition was a task filled with suffocating, silent anxiety. The traditional regional chiefs and the rising Western-educated young officers watched the complex strategic movements of the royal family with a mixture of intense expectation and lingering defensive panic, knowing that a single tactical misstep could erase 3,000 years of uninterrupted independence. Inside the quiet, stone-walled palace chambers, the air remained heavy with the distant thunder of modern artillery and unwritten destinies, leaving the ultimate survival of the world's oldest monarchy to balance on a razor's edge. Let us recross the Mediterranean, leaving the ancient highlands of Africa behind to settle once more upon the jagged, strategically vital coastlines of the Balkan Peninsula, along the narrow waters of the Adriatic Sea. We arrive in the tense, unpredictable months of 1938 within the borders of the young and vulnerable kingdom of Albania. Nestled directly in the geopolitical crosshairs of fascist Italy, Albania was viewed by Benito Mussolini as the natural starting point for his ambitious dreams of a modern Roman Empire. Its monarch, King Zog I, a self-made ruler who had successfully consolidated power over the region's fiercely independent tribal clans, understood that his nation's fragile sovereignty was running out of time. To deter a foreign invasion, he needed to instantly elevate his dynasty's international legitimacy. The solution was a highly calculated, swiftly arranged matrimonial alliance that connected the royal court in Tirana directly to the old prestigious aristocracy of Central Europe. In April 1938, King Zog was wed to Countess Geraldine Apponyi de Nagyaponi. Geraldine was a figure of exceptional international complexity. She was a beautiful, highly educated Hungarian noblewoman whose mother was a wealthy American heiress. To foreign intelligence agencies watching from Rome and Vienna, this marriage was far more than a glittering royal romance. It was a desperate, brilliant diplomatic countermove designed to break Albania's growing economic isolation and anchor the young kingdom within a wider Western network. The royal wedding in Tirana was celebrated with immense national pride, serving as a direct message of defiance to Italian colonial ambitions. Queen Geraldine brought an instant, transformative energy to the traditionalist Albanian court. Utilizing her extensive family connections in Budapest, Vienna and Washington, she quietly established a modern, highly connected diplomatic salon within the royal palace. Through her private networks, she sought to diversify Albania's foreign trade, secure independent financial credits, and attract humanitarian aid, systematically working to weaken the aggressive financial monopolies that Fascist Italy had used to infiltrate the country's infrastructure. This strategic union effectively transformed Albania's image from an isolated Balkan territory into a recognized, internationally connected European state. Geraldine's unique American and Hungarian heritage created a powerful, silent wave of sympathy in Western newspapers, forcing international diplomats to pay closer attention to the strategic value of the Adriatic coast. Her presence provided King Zog with a highly sophisticated advisor who could analyze continental political currents, ensuring that the small kingdom's voice was heard in foreign capitals where its independence was quietly being bartered away. Yet challenging the immediate imperial expansion of a powerful neighbor on the absolute eve of a global conflict was a path filled with suffocating immediate danger. The Italian military advisors and covert agents embedded within the country watched the new queen's modernizing influence and Western connections with deep hostility, accelerating their secret operational plans for an outright military takeover. In the quiet, breeze-cooled chambers of the royal palace, as the first signs of spring arrived along the Adriatic, the air remained heavy with the distant rumble of foreign warships and unwritten destinies, leaving the ultimate survival of the young dynasty to face an unstoppable approaching storm. Let us cross the Atlantic once more, leaving the fractured coastlines of the Adriatic behind to settle upon the vast, fertile pampas and grand European-style avenues of South America. We arrive in the turbulent, transformative months of 1945 within the borders of the Argentine Republic, In the wake of the Second World War, Argentina was shaking with profound social and economic friction. The traditional conservative elite, who had ruled the nation's vast agricultural wealth for generations, found themselves facing a massive, newly industrialized urban working class that was demanding a political voice. In this volatile environment, a brilliant and ambitious military colonel named Juan Domingo Perón realized that to reshape the destiny of the nation, he needed a completely unprecedented kind of domestic alliance. The strategic catalyst for this political revolution was a marriage that shattered every unwritten rule of Argentine high society. In October 1945, shortly after a historic mass mobilization of workers secured his release from military imprisonment, Juan Perón was wed to Eva Duarte, a charismatic young radio actress known affectionately to the masses as Evita. To the traditional oligarchy in Buenos Aires, this union was viewed with absolute horror and aristocratic disdain. But in the calculated arena of modern populist politics, the marriage was a masterstroke of structural consolidation, binding the raw power of the military reformists directly to the emotional heart of the nation's labor movement. Eva Duarte Perón was far more than a traditional political spouse. She became the co-architect, the primary communicator, and the spiritual anchor of the emerging Peronist movement. Together, they constructed a formidable political duumvirate that systematically dismantled the old electoral machinery, lifting Perón to the presidency in a landslide victory in 1946, while Juan managed the complex infrastructure of state planning, industrialization, and military relations. Evita utilized her extraordinary oratorical power and deep empathy to organize the working-class masses, the descamisados, caught shirtless ones, into an unyielding, fanatically loyal political shield. The structural impact of this matrimonial alliance completely rewrote the socio-political landscape of South America. Through the Eva Perón Foundation and her unofficial leadership of the Ministry of Labor, Evita bypassed the traditional conservative charity networks of the elite, building thousands of schools, hospitals, and housing projects directly for the poor. Her relentless political maneuvering secured women's suffrage in 1947, instantly doubling the nation's electorate and locking in a massive, unassailable voting bloc for the regime. This marriage had effectively transformed the Argentine state from an oligarchic republic into a highly centralized, socially progressive corporate state, fiercely independent of both Western capitalism and Soviet communism, yet challenging the deeply entrenched power of the traditional aristocracy and foreign economic interests during the early, tense years of the Cold War. Was a path filled with escalating silent fury. The military high command, the old money families, and nervous international diplomats watched the young couple's radical concentration of executive power and immense popular adoration with a mixture of intense scrutiny and growing paranoia. Inside the grand stately rooms of the Casa Rosada in Buenos Aires, the air remained thick with whispered conspiracies, economic imbalances, and unwritten threats, leaving the ultimate fate of this political dynasty to balance on a deeply fragile, highly volatile edge. Let us leave the grand avenues of South America behind, letting our thoughts rise high into the clouds, scaling the majestic, mist-shrouded peaks of the eastern Himalaya. We arrive in the early 1960s within the borders of the tiny, ancient Buddhist kingdom of Sikkim. Positioned precisely along a perilous geopolitical fault line, this mountain realm found itself squeezed between two massive colliding giants, the newly independent Republic of India and the rapidly expanding People's Republic of China. As Cold War tensions escalated along the high alpine borders, the ruling Namgyel dynasty understood that to preserve their kingdom's fragile independence and unique cultural identity, they desperately needed to project their voice onto the international stage. The diplomatic catalyst for this mountain statecraft came in March 1963 through an extraordinary, highly unconventional marriage that connected the remote palaces of Gangtok directly to the elite social circles of New York City. Crown Prince Polden Thondup Namgyal was wed to Hope Cook, a brilliant young American graduate from Sarah Lawrence College. To global media outlets, the wedding was celebrated as a real-life fairy tale, capturing the imagination of the Western world. But within the inner council chambers of the Himalayan region and watching foreign ministries, this union was recognized as a highly strategic move designed to internationalize Sikkim's sovereign status. Hope Cook, ascending the throne as the Gyalmo, Queen of Sikkim, quickly became far more than a symbolic consort. Possessing a deep interest in history and anthropology, she utilized her modern education and Western media connections to launch an intense program of cultural preservation. She systematically restructured the kingdom's educational curriculum to emphasize the native Sikkimese language and history, championed local cottage industries, and wrote numerous articles for international journals. Her quiet diplomacy effectively transformed Sikkim from a forgotten protectorate territory into a recognized, distinct cultural entity in the eyes of Western diplomats and intellectuals. This marital alliance constructed a powerful, silent, diplomatic shield. By bringing an American woman to the throne, the Namgyal dynasty succeeded in attracting global attention, foreign journalists, and international travelers to Gangtok, making any unilateral political moves by neighboring superpowers a matter of international scrutiny. The Gyalmo's presence provided the king with a highly literate advisor who could help articulate Sikkim's sovereign rights and distinct treaty status, working to ensure that the ancient kingdom's independence was not quietly erased behind the closed doors of regional administrative offices, yet asserting absolute cultural and political sovereignty in a region locked in an intense border conflict was a path filled with escalating immediate danger. The local political factions, the nervous security advisors in New Delhi, and foreign military observers watched the royal couple's modernizing efforts and international assertiveness with deep suspicion and growing unease. In the quiet, incense-scented chambers of the Suklakhang Palace, looking out over the snow-capped peak of Mount Kanchenjunga, the air grew increasingly heavy with whispered political maneuvers, changing regional treaties and unwritten futures, leaving the ultimate survival of this ancient Buddhist kingdom to balance on a deeply fragile, highly volatile edge. Let us descend from the high, mist-shrouded peaks of the Himalaya and travel westward, letting our thoughts settle once more upon the ancient, sun-baked desert plateaus and strategic valley corridors of the Levant. We arrive in the late 1970s within the borders of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, positioned at the absolute burning center of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Jordan was a small nation forced to constantly navigate a treacherous sea of shifting regional alliances, radical revolutionary movements, and intense Cold War rivalries. Its ruler, King Hussein, understood that for his kingdom to survive as a sanctuary of stability, he needed to forge a unique, highly sophisticated bridge that could interpret the complex realities of the Arab world directly to the skeptical superpower networks of the West. The diplomatic anchor for this geopolitical balancing act emerged in June 1978 through a deeply unconventional international marriage. King Hussein was wed to Lisa Halaby, an exceptionally brilliant American woman of Syrian-Lebanese aristocratic descent, who was an Ivy League graduate of Princeton University in architecture and urban planning. Upon her marriage and conversion to Islam, she was named Queen Noor al-Hussein, the Light of Hussein. To foreign intelligence networks and watching diplomats in Washington and London, this union was recognized as a masterstroke of soft power diplomacy, instantly humanizing and modernizing the international image of the Hashemite dynasty. Queen Noor quickly evolved into far more than a traditional royal consort. She became a highly articulate, independent ambassador for Jordan's geopolitical neutrality, Utilizing her sophisticated Western education and deep cultural roots in the region, she systematically established extensive humanitarian, educational, and environmental foundations across the country. She transformed the royal palace into an active, globally connected hub, hosting international journalists, intellectuals, and political leaders, and effectively utilizing Western media outlets to advocate for regional peace, refugee rights, and sustainable economic development. This strategic partnership constructed an invisible, yet incredibly resilient diplomatic shield for Jordan, at a time when the Middle East was being deeply fractured by the Iranian Revolution and escalating civil conflicts. The unified household of Hussein and Noor allowed Jordan to project a unique identity as a progressive, modern, and highly rational mediating force. Queen Noor's extensive private and public networks in the United States provided the king with a vital, direct channel to explain Jordan's complex strategic constraints to Western lawmakers, ensuring that crucial economic aid and military defensive support continued to flow to Amman despite intense geopolitical pressures, yet maintaining an oasis of peace in a region continuously dry with the heat of impending war was a path filled with escalating, suffocating tension. The conservative tribal factions within Jordan and the radical ideological movements across its borders watched the Queen's progressive reforms and Western influence with a mixture of intense scrutiny and lingering hostility. In the quiet, breeze-cooled chambers of the Nadwa Palace in Amman, the air remained heavy with whispered conspiracies, changing regional pacts, and unwritten futures, leaving the ultimate legacy of this historic union to face the rapidly gathering, dark clouds of a new era of global conflict. Let us adjust our sails and travel southwestward across the vast desert expanses, leaving the Levant behind to settle within the sun-baked, red dirt landscapes of the West African Sahel. We arrive in the volatile, highly unpredictable mid-1980s, an era defined by the fierce remnants of Cold War proxy struggles and rapid waves of revolutionary alignment across the African continent. In the newly renamed Republic of Burkina Faso, formerly Upper Volta, a young, ambitious military officer named Blaise Compaoré watched the radical, anti-imperialist direction of his nation's government with growing calculation. He understood that to secure a dominant, permanent position of authority in a region surrounded by hostile pro-Western neighbors, he needed to forge a highly sophisticated transnational alliance. The structural bridge for this geopolitical realignment was constructed through a discreet, exceptionally powerful matrimonial union arranged in 1985. Blaise Compaoré was wed to Chantal Terrasson de Fougères. Chantal was a figure of immense diplomatic weight within the francophone African elite. She was the foster daughter of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the towering, deeply wealthy president of neighbouring Côte d'Ivoire. To casual foreign observers, it appeared to be a routine marriage between a rising military officer and a refined woman of high society. But within the intelligence networks of Paris, Abidjan, and Ouagadougou, this union was recognized as a masterstroke of soft power infiltration, connecting a radical military regime directly to the iron core of Françafrique, the powerful neo-colonial network of French influence in Africa. Chantal Terrasson de Fougères became far more than a supportive spouse. She acted as a silent, highly effective diplomatic conduit. Her presence and family ties instantly softened the international image of Compaoré, providing him with a private, direct line of communication to the most influential, Western-backed capitals in West Africa, when the historic, violent coup of 1987 resulted in the death of the charismatic revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara and lifted Compaoré to the absolute presidency. It was this pre-established Ivorian and French connection that immediately shielded the new regime from international isolation, securing vital economic credits and foreign military backing. The structural consequences of this marriage completely rewrote the balance of power across West Africa for the next 3 decades. Through the immense diplomatic architecture anchored by his wife's family networks, Comparet successfully transitioned from a young coup leader into a powerful, Western-trusted regional mediator. Ouagadougou was transformed into a bustling hub for international statecraft, where conflicts in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Togo were quietly negotiated under French and Ivorian supervision. This matrimonial alliance had effectively anchored Burkina Faso into a conservative, highly stable economic and military axis, ensuring the regime's survival against constant internal opposition. Yet managing a nation's destiny through the delicate machinery of foreign elite networks and shifting regional loyalties was a path filled with deep, silent friction. The local trade unions, student movements, and remnants of the old Revolutionary Guard watched the presidential couple's growing wealth, French connections, and centralized authority with a mixture of intense resentment and simmering fury. Inside the quiet, air-conditioned rooms of the Koziam Palace, the air remained heavy with unwritten political arrangements, intelligence briefs, and hidden vulnerabilities, leaving the ultimate legacy of this long-lasting dynasty to face the unpredictable, gathering winds of a changing generation. Let us leave the red dirt landscapes of the Sahel behind, crossing the vast waters of the Indian Ocean to return once more to the humid, river-fed plains and ancient stone temples of mainland Southeast Asia. We arrive in the momentous opening years of the 1950s. Chaotic and deeply transformative era when the old architecture of French Indochina was rapidly collapsing under the weight of national liberation movements. In the Kingdom of Cambodia, a young, intensely patriotic king named Norodom Sihanouk found himself caught in a terrifying geopolitical vice, trapped between the fading grip of French colonialism and the aggressive rising currents of the global Cold War. To secure his nation's absolute independence without being consumed by neighboring conflicts, he needed an exceptional domestic anchor. The structural solution to this diplomatic puzzle was a marriage that would fundamentally shape Cambodian statecraft for the next half-century. In April 1952, King Sihanouk was wed to Monique Izzy, a brilliant, multilingual young woman of French, Corsican and Khmer aristocratic descent, who would later be known to the world as Queen Norodom Moninith Sihanouk. To the old conservative factions within the royal court of Phnom Penh, the union was initially viewed with traditional caution. But in the volatile arena of mid-century Asian diplomacy, Monique brought a rare combination of European analytical education and deep, instinctual devotion to the preservation of the Khmer state. Monique Izzy quickly evolved from a beautiful consort into Sihanouk's most trusted political confidant, strategic advisor, and independent diplomat. Together, they constructed a highly sophisticated political framework based on strict international neutrality, refusing to align Cambodia with either the Western blocs or the expanding communist coalitions. While Sihanouk utilized his theatrical charisma on the world stage, Monique managed the delicate internal dynamics of the palace, serving as a vital bridge to the nation's progressive youth, intellectuals and women's organizations, successfully transforming the traditional monarchy into a popular symbol of modern, unified independence. The structural consequences of this matrimonial partnership became a defining shield for Cambodia throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Monique's cosmopolitan background and exceptional diplomatic poise allowed her to transform the royal court into an elegant, non-threatening sanctuary for international statecraft. She personally facilitated historic meetings with world leaders ranging from France's Charles de Gaulle to China's Zhou Enlai, helping Sihanouk extract massive amounts of unconditional foreign aid from competing superpowers while keeping Cambodia out of the devastating conflict engulfing neighboring Vietnam. Yet, holding a small neutral kingdom together in the absolute center of a global ideological storm was a task filled with suffocating silent terror. The local radical movements, the corrupt military commanders, and foreign covert intelligence agencies watched the royal couple's neutralist tightrope walk with a mixture of intense frustration and covert hostility waiting for any opportunity to destabilize the throne. In the quiet, fan-cooled rooms of the Hemarin Palace in Phnom Penh, the air remained thick with whispered conspiracies, changing regional treaties, and unwritten dangers, leaving the ultimate survival of their ancient civilization to balance on a deeply fragile, precarious edge. Let us travel northwestward across the rich tropical forests of Asia, navigating back toward the sun-blanched limestone cliffs and endless desert horizons of North Africa, where the Mediterranean waves crash against the ancient shores of Tripoli. We arrive in the early 1930s, within a vast fractured territory enduring the brutal iron-fisted military colonization of fascist Italy. The lands of Cyrenaica, Tripolitania and Fezzan, which would later form the modern state of Libya, were deeply divided by ancient tribal rivalries, regional suspicions and scattered resistance movements. To forge a unified national front capable of survival, Sayyid Idris el-Senussi, the hereditary leader of the powerful Senussi religious and political order, understood that he needed an exceptional structural alliance to bind the fiercely independent desert clans together. The diplomatic anchor for this North African unification was an extraordinary marriage celebrated in exile in 1931. Idris was wed to Fatima el-Sharif, a woman of immense spiritual and revolutionary lineage. Fatima was the daughter of Sayyid Ahmed el-Sharif, a legendary former Grand Senussi and a renowned commander who had led historic military campaigns against both British and Italian colonial forces. To foreign intelligence agencies watching from Rome and Cairo, this union was recognized as a profound consolidation of traditional authority, merging the two most influential branches of the Senussi order and instantly reconciling decades of internal factional competition. Fatima el-Sharif brought to the marriage far more than ancestral prestige. She possessed a formidable, highly educated intellect and an unyielding commitment to the cause of Libyan sovereignty. Throughout the long, difficult years of exile in Egypt, the household of Idris and Fatima functioned as the supreme diplomatic headquarters for the Libyan liberation movement. Fatima utilized her deep family networks across the Arab world to secure financial resources, organize humanitarian aid for refugees, and coordinate communication between scattered resistance cells operating inside the occupied territories, effectively transforming a religious dynasty into a modern government in exile. The structural impact of this matrimonial alliance became the literal foundation of the state in the wake of the Second World War. When the United Nations declared the independence of a unified United Kingdom of Libya in December 1951, Idris ascended the throne as its first king, with Fatima serving as a deeply revered, highly progressive queen consort. Her presence on the throne was the essential psychological glue that compelled the historically suspicious chieftains of Tripolitania and Fezzan to accept the crown's centralized authority, establishing the first constitutional monarchy in modern Libyan history and launching rapid educational and medical advancements for women. Yet, managing a newly born desert kingdom caught in the sudden, destabilizing whirlwind of massive international oil discoveries and rising pan-Arab radicalism was a path filled with suffocating, silent tension. The young, nationalistic military officers and foreign corporate agents watched the royal family's traditional balancing act and close strategic treaties with Western powers with a mixture of intense scrutiny and covert hostility. Inside the quiet, breeze-cooled halls of the Almanar Palace in Benghazi, the air remained heavy with whispered political maneuvers, changing oil concessions, and unwritten threats, leaving the ultimate survival of their historic dynasty to face the unpredictable, gathering storms of a completely transformed region. Let us leave the desert coastlines of North Africa behind, travelling northeastward across the rugged mountain ranges of the Middle East to ascend into the high, wind-swept plateaus and fortress-like valleys of Central Asia. We arrive in the momentous opening years of the 1930s, within the sovereign borders of the Kingdom of Afghanistan. Positioned historically as a vital buffer state at the absolute intersection of global empires, Afghanistan was emerging from a decade of violent civil war, tribal rebellions, and rapid dynastic overthrows. Caught in the lingering shadow of the great game between British India and the expanding Soviet Union, the newly established Musahiban royal line understood that to survive, the monarchy needed to forge an unbreakable internal alliance capable of binding the country's fiercely independent ethnic and tribal factions to a centralized throne. The structural anchor for this delicate political stabilization materialized in November 1931 through a meticulously calculated matrimonial alliance. Prince Muhammad Zaher Shah, the young heir to the throne, was wed to Humaira Begum. This union carried immense strategic weight for the domestic cohesion of the fractured nation. While Zaher Shah represented the ruling royal household, Humaira was the daughter of Ahmad Shah Khan, a towering military commander and a highly influential nobleman from the prestigious Yahya Khel clan. Her lineage connected the crown directly to the powerful Pashtun tribal elite, the literal warrior class whose traditional consensus dictated the survival of any Afghan ruler. Humaira Begum quickly evolved from a traditional royal consort into an indispensable asset for the modernizing state. When her husband suddenly ascended the throne as king in 1933, following the tragic assassination of his father, the young queen provided a calm, unwavering center of gravity for the court, utilizing her sophisticated private education and deep understanding of tribal diplomacy. She acted as a silent mediator between the conservative religious councils and the progressive elements within the government, ensuring that the early, fragile years of Zaher Shah's reign were marked by unprecedented internal peace and structural stability. The long-term consequences of this marriage became a powerful protective shield for Afghanistan throughout the mid-20th century. Together, the royal couple championed a steady, cautious program of modern social reforms, culminating in the historic voluntary removal of the traditional veil for women in 1959 and the establishment of a liberal constitutional monarchy in 1964. Humaira's active public presence as a modern, globally minded queen helped reshape Afghanistan's international image, allowing the kingdom to secure massive infrastructural and educational aid from both Western and Eastern Bloc nations, while strictly maintaining its historic, non-aligned neutrality. Yet, steering a traditional, deeply religious mountain kingdom along the sharp edge of modern secular reforms and Cold War superpower rivalries was a path filled with suffocating, silent tension. The radical Marxist factions brewing in the expanding universities and the conservative tribal chieftains in the remote provinces watched the royal family's progressive trajectory with a mixture of intense scrutiny and mounting hostility. Inside the quiet, rose-scented gardens of the Chihil Situn Palace in Kabul, the air remained heavy with whispered conspiracies, shifting military loyalties and unwritten futures, leaving the ultimate survival of this decades-long golden era to face the unpredictable, gathering storms of an approaching ideological conflict. Let us journey back to the European continent, descending from the high wind-swept passes of the Hindu Kush into the jagged, politically volatile valleys of the Balkan Peninsula, where the Danube flows toward the Black Sea. We arrive in the opening months of 1930 within the borders of the Kingdom of Bulgaria. Still reeling from the catastrophic territorial and economic losses of the First World War, Bulgaria stood deeply isolated in European diplomacy, surrounded by suspicious regional neighbours and facing intense subversion from rising Marxist movements. Its ruler, Tsar Boris III, a highly astute, deeply cautious monarch, understood that to protect his nation from being dismembered or consumed by internal revolution, he desperately needed a powerful international anchor to restore Bulgaria's geopolitical prestige. The strategic solution was a meticulously negotiated dynastic alliance that connected the court in Sofia directly to one of the major victors of the Great War. In October 1930, Tsar Boris was wed to Princess Giovanna of Italy, the daughter of King Vittorio Emanuele III, and a member of the powerful House of Savoy. To international diplomats watching from Paris and London, this marriage was far more than a glittering royal celebration. It was a high-stakes geopolitical masterstroke that shattered Bulgaria's post-war diplomatic isolation, establishing a direct, protective axis with a dominant Mediterranean power capable of balancing regional pressures. Princess Giovanna, who became Tsaritsa Ioanna upon her arrival, brought an immense wave of soft power and international legitimacy to the Bulgarian throne. Navigating the union required extraordinary diplomatic finesse. Ioanna utilized her refined education, deep empathy, and extensive European networks to transform the royal palace into an active, highly respected center of international charity and cultural diplomacy, instantly softening Bulgaria's image abroad and opening new channels for economic and trade integration with Western Europe. This matrimonial alliance functioned as an invisible protective shield during the highly volatile decade of the 1930s. The direct connection to the Italian crown provided Tsar Boris with the diplomatic leverage needed to reconstruct Bulgaria's shattered military infrastructure and reassert its sovereign rights in regional Balkan pacts without triggering immediate intervention from hostile neighbouring states. Ioanna's presence at the court offered the Tsar a deeply loyal, politically sophisticated confidante who could decipher the aggressive, shifting strategies of the major European powers, helping the small kingdom maintain its precarious internal stability. Yet steering a nation along the fracturing fault lines of European politics on the absolute eve of a global conflagration was a task filled with suffocating, silent dread. The rising radical right-wing factions within the military, the covert communist operatives, and the aggressive expansionist demands of totalitarian empires watched the royal couple's balanced diplomatic tightrope with mounting impatience. Inside the quiet, wood-panelled chambers of the Vrana Palace in Sofia, the air grew increasingly heavy with whispered ultimata, shifting secret treaties and unwritten destinies, leaving the ultimate survival of the young dynasty to face the gathering, catastrophic storm of an approaching world war. Let us unfurl our sails and plunge into a deep historical currents of the Atlantic, turning the wheel of time back to the early decades of the 19th century, to settle upon the dramatic, mountain-framed shores of Rio de Janeiro. We arrive in an extraordinary era when the traditional global hierarchy was being radically upended by the Napoleonic Wars. Having fled the French invasion of Lisbon, the Portuguese royal house of Braganza had taken the unprecedented step of relocating their entire imperial court to the vast colony of Brazil, transforming this tropical territory into the new administrative heart of their empire. To secure this newfound American sovereignty and prevent the colony from fracturing into radical, republican revolutions like its Spanish-speaking neighbours, the crown required a monumental alliance with the oldest conservative powers of Europe. The geopolitical anchor for this South American transformation materialized in November 1817 through a deeply calculated dynastic union. Crown Prince Dom Pedro was wed to Archduchess Maria Leopoldina of Austria, a member of the illustrious House of Habsburg and the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. To European diplomats meeting at the Congress of Vienna, this marriage was a high-stakes alignment designed to anchor the European restoration firmly into the soil of the New World. Leopoldina, a woman of exceptional intellectual depth, an accomplished natural scientist and a sharp political analyst, arrived in Rio de Janeiro not merely as a bride, but as an independent diplomatic vanguard for one of the most powerful empires on earth. Archduchess Leopoldina quickly evolved into the true intellectual powerhouse and primary political strategist of the Brazilian court. As the years progressed, and Portugal attempted to strip Brazil of its royal status and reduce it back to a submissive, exploited colony, Leopoldina recognized that the survival of her family's legacy depended on a daring counter-move. While Dom Pedro travelled across the provinces to suppress regional unrest, he appointed Leopoldina as his official prince regent. In September 1822, facing aggressive ultimata from Lisbon, it was Leopoldina who officially presided over the Council of State, utilising her profound understanding of constitutional law to sign the historic decree of separation, urging her husband to declare the absolute independence of the new Empire of Brazil. The structural impact of this matrimonial alliance completely rewrote the geopolitical landscape of the Americas. Leopoldina's impeccable Habsburg lineage provided the newly born empire with instant, invaluable international legitimacy, forcing the skeptical European monarchies to recognize Brazil's sovereignty far ahead of any other South American revolutionary state. This marriage had effectively transformed a massive slave-holding colony into an independent, highly centralized constitutional empire, preserving monarchical stability and territorial unity across a vast continent that was otherwise fracturing into fragmented, unstable republics. Yet steering a newly independent empire through the uncharted waters of American politics and deep social inequality was a path filled with suffocating, immediate danger. The radical Republican factions, the mutinous military units, and the lingering pro-Portuguese loyalists watched the imperial couple's centralized rule and heavy European connections with growing hostility and suspicion. Inside the quiet, humid chambers of the Quinta da Boa Vista in Rio de Janeiro, the air remained thick with whispered conspiracies, financial instability, and unwritten threats, leaving the ultimate survival of this new tropical dynasty to face the unpredictable, violent storms of a rapidly changing continent. We have traced the invisible red-inked lines of matrimonial statecraft across 5 centuries and every continent, watching the delicate architecture of dynastic alliances build empires, trigger world wars, and dictate the sovereignty of nations. From the frozen corridors of St. Petersburg to the tropical palaces of Southeast Asia, from the ancient mountains of Ethiopia to the modern, media-driven political arenas of Argentina and Jordan, these 39 couples did not merely live through history, they became the literal structural anchors upon which the geopolitical map of the world was drawn and redrawn. Yet as our journey reaches its ultimate horizon, a profound, recurring historical truth reveals itself. These strategic marriages, designed as the ultimate mechanism to control the future, neutralize threats, and preserve the continuity of power, were ultimately fragile vessels launched into a vast, unyielding ocean of human transformation. No calculated treaty, no immaculate lineage, and no sophisticated diplomatic salon could indefinitely hold back the sweeping, unpredictable storms of popular revolutions, economic collapses, and the relentless rise of modern democratic nationalism. Many of the very dynasties that sought survival through these brilliant unions were ultimately swept away into the margins of time. The palaces we visited, once thick with whispered conspiracies, secret intelligence briefs, and the heavy air of unwritten destinies, now stand as quiet, echo-filled museums or stone ruins, preserved only for the curious eyes of travellers. The absolute power they protected has faded, leaving behind only the cold, hard currency of historical consequence. But the legacy of these unions remains completely indelible. They serve as a powerful, lingering testament to an era when individual human partnerships were the literal gears of global statecraft. In the quiet, dusty archives where the original marriage contracts and secret peace treaties now rest, the ghosts of these monarchs, presidents, queens, and political strategists continue to remind us that the destiny of our world is never shaped by blind chance alone. It is carved, piece by piece, by the daring, calculating, and deeply vulnerable choices of those who dared to bind their hearts to the raw, dangerous machinery of absolute power. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.